IB Nation, welcome to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. Missed y'all yesterday. We had a nice, relaxing 4th of July day, myself and Angela, so we just kind of chilled yesterday. Had some burgers and had some potato salad, some watermelon, watched the Patriot. Really nice 4th of July. Nice, relaxing 4th of July. Back today, ready for another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. So we're mixing things up a little bit today. I had a meeting I had to be at today that took a little while, a little longer than expected. We were only going to have one show today because Sean Stiers is out today. So I decided to have the show tonight. So we're going to have the show, and it's our midweek rundown. And there's a lot of topics we're going to discuss today. We're really going to get into 3 topics, 2 Notre Dame related, 1 more college football related. And I think that this is a good time to have this conversation. And we've had it a little bit before in different formats, but I wanted to dive into it today. And the first part of the show is going to be about discussing, can Notre Dame really win a championship? I'm seeing more and more of this from Notre Dame fans, and I think it's a grieving. I don't know if I don't say grieving process. It's a coping mechanism, perhaps. This notion that Notre Dame can't win a title because of insert A, B, C, D reason why. And it's just too hard, and it's all these different reasons. So we're gonna dive into that. We're gonna address some of the things that I think go into this notion that Notre Dame can't compete for a championship that I think are faulty. Some of them that I do think are not legitimate reasons to say they can't win, but I think are legitimate reasons to say that maybe it is a little harder, and they just you have to overcome certain things, but it doesn't mean that you can't win a title. And we'll dive into that. I'm also on these midweek rundowns here over the next few weeks, going to start diving into sort of a state of recruiting. I think this is a perfect time to do this. Just kind of where Notre Dame is right now with recruiting in the 24 class. We'll look at or actually at a position, right, or side of the ball. And so we'll look at, where are they in regard to right now in the 24 class? Where are they in the 25 class? Is this a position of strength? Where are they moving forward? And today we're going to talk about the defensive recruiting at situation, and we'll dive into where it is right now. What are some of the issues that have to get addressed, and what's happening now that needs to be addressed, and what changes need to happen where are they not recruiting where they need to be. And then we'll dive into more position specific stuff in future shows. The third one is going to be a bit of a college football look with a very strong Notre Dame influence, and that is going to be the thought of the biggest games non-conference. What are the non-conference games this year? They're going to have the biggest impact on the college football season. We're going to dive into that in part 3. I'll ask that y'all bear with me a little bit. I'm gonna ask for a little bit of grace tonight. Obviously, we're not doing a mailbag because it's a solo show, but my voice is also pretty shot today, so I'm going to need to take some breaks to put some tea down, and so I'm going to have to mute myself a couple times. I would just ask for a little bit of patience when it comes to that, because I do want to be able to survive the show, because I really do want to talk about this stuff, because I do think it's some very interesting topics, and y'all are here with me, so I think y'all are willing to talk about this stuff too. So just appreciate a little bit of patience when it comes to that, and here's going to be the first time. So part 1 of today's show, and let's get into it. The notion that has existed for a while outside of Notre Dame circles is now something that I'm seeing more and more Notre Dame fans start to believe. And that is the notion that Notre Dame cannot win a national championship for whatever reason. And, what are some of the primary reasons that we constantly hear? Oh, they can't win because academics. Right? You can't win at an academic institution because kids just don't care about academics anymore. And while that might be true with some players, I don't think that's true with most players. We talked about this last year. I mean, Keon Keeley, Peyton Bowen, those are guys that were not guys that didn't have interest in academics. They just have interest in other things. And Marcus Freeman has made this point as when he was a defensive coordinator. He's made this point as the head coach. It's something that I firmly believe is to be true. Great football players, top football players, the needle movers, right? The guys that everybody talks about. You can't win if you don't get insert player A, B, C, or D. And you look at their track records and say, well, boy, this guy has good grades. He would seem to fit the profile. Why won't he come to Notre Dame? Well, I would argue that number one, a lot still do. And I would argue that number two, what Marcus Freeman has said in the past is you can't just sell academics. You also have to have a football product that matches. Because if you are a great business student, or if you are aspiring to be a doctor and you're the best in your class in high school, or you're undergraduate, or whatever the case may be, if you're trying to be a lawyer, whatever the case may be, whatever you're trying to do, at the end of the day, you're going to look at yourself and you're going to say, okay, I want to be among the best in my field. And so when you're going down into whether I'm going to go to Notre Dame Business School, I'm going to go to Wharton, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there, you're going to look at what? You're going to look at things that are going to say, what schools do the best job of producing people into my chosen field? It's the same thing for big time football players. And right now, academics is great for Notre Dame. It helps Notre Dame even get in the door, but the other parts have got to be better. So I think that's something that I look at and say, I think that's part of, to me, the conversation. Then you get down to some of the other reasons that people give why they can't win. You can't recruit big time players because of the location. Most of the big time players in the South. I think that's a fair assessment to make as far as what makes it harder. It's not something that keeps Notre Dame from winning. You look at, well, you can't win in the NIL era. You can't win in the transfer portal era. And my response to that is I still think Notre Dame fans are living in a bit of a fantasy world that Notre Dame does not compete in NIL, and they do. They are competitive in NIL, not just from the transfer portal process, but with their current players. And it's only getting better. Are where they need to be? No, they're not where they need to be. Are they maximized what their potential is? No, they're not. But I think they're also doing it in a bit of a sound way where they're just not hurling money at players. Look, Notre Dame's never going to get into the buying players business. But guys, giving players upfront money now is no different than it was when Eric Dickerson was getting a Trans Am from, or was a Corvette or a Trans Am or whatever it was from Texas A&M. This has been going on for a long time. Players that have their hand out for whatever reason, righteously or not, we're never going to come to Notre Dame to begin with. I would argue that NIL has helped Notre Dame with players because they may not be offering the money that some other schools are, but the fact that they can now offer money, and basically if you're a 4-year player at Notre Dame, you'll at least get 6 figures from your time here from an NIL package, and that's if you have no other NIL whatsoever to speak of. So this notion that Notre Dame's not competitive in the NIL, they may not be where they need to be, but NIL has actually helped Notre Dame. The transfer portal has helped Notre Dame, freeing up scholarships, but also allowed them to go out and be competitive on the transfer market. Look at the guys they've brought in this year. Now, I know that theirs is the graduate market, but that's okay. It still works. You talk about Sam Hartman, Javante Jean-Baptiste, Thomas Harper, Antonio Carter, Spencer Sanders, and Ben Krim. Where would our expectations for Notre Dame be this season if there was no Sam Hartman, if there was no Thomas Harper or Antonio Carter or Javante Jean-Baptiste? You'd probably be looking at this team a little bit different. I can assure you that there have been players that have been offered big deals from other schools as far as upfront guaranteed money that I'm talking at least 1 or 2 players that we know of that have been offered 7 figures over the course of their careers that come out and say, hey, I'm not getting that number from Notre Dame, but I'm getting enough to where the other stuff about Notre Dame is going to make it to where I want to go to Notre Dame. And so that's basically where they're able to be competitive that they weren't. So I just think that's another misnomer. I think that Notre Dame is working to build it up. They're just, as Notre Dame does, they'll probably do it a little slower than others because they have we want to do it right mentality. Agree or disagree with that? I think there's things they can still do better, and that's part of the growing process, but they're competitive there. And then the other notion that I hear a lot is, well, at the end of the day, you just, kids are different these days. And my answer is, in a lot of ways, that's very true, and it's not good. And in other ways, it's very true, but it actually is good for Notre Dame. Because when you look at players now, players have access to so much more information now. In the last, especially 5 to 8 years, 5 to 10 years, I have I have seen for when it comes to Notre Dame, I have seen several instances where covering recruiting, I should say, where you see kids really start to think more about life after football than they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Not all kids. A lot of kids are still short-sighted, but there's a lot more that you look at and say, this kid is a lot more thoughtful than they used to be. Keon Keeley's decision to go to Alabama, I use this a lot. That was not a taking a payout situation. It was not an NIL situation. Am I saying he didn't get I'm not saying he didn't get NIL money. I'm saying that wasn't the decision for him. There were other schools that offered him a lot more money, NIL, than Alabama did. I can assure you that. What it came down to, though, is Keon was trying to think big picture, long term for what he wants to do with his life. And Alabama, he felt was the right choice. So I think this notion that players don't care about the things that Notre Dame cares about. I had someone in the chat the other day said, Notre Dame can't get big time players because kids aren't going to stay long enough to care about the degree. And for football, that's just nonsense. That's just not accurate. That's not factual. So many kids nowadays are staying for 3 years and getting degrees. Talked about Bryce Young at Alabama, got a degree in 3 years. So I just think there's a lot of things that we assume to be true and we assume to be reasons why Notre Dame can't win that I just don't think are legitimate reasons that they can't win. Some of them are legitimate in that it's harder, but that's always been true. The academic piece was true in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. The notion that some players just don't care about academics, again, also true in the 80s and that I know of, and early 90s when Lou Holtz was landing number one classes every year. I think there's a lot of misconceptions. I think the issues is more about Notre Dame and whether or not Notre Dame has made the right choices, made the right decisions, hired the right coaches, and taking the steps that they're capable of taking to compete for a championship. And so, do I think it's harder for Notre Dame? Yeah, I do. I do think it's harder for Notre Dame. But it was harder for Notre Dame when Lou Holtz was at Notre Dame as well. It was harder for Notre Dame in the 70s under Eric Parsegian as well. That's always been true. And to me, it's not good evidence that Notre Dame can't win a championship when it comes to big-time college football. I also think here's another one that I've heard a lot lately. The fact that Notre Dame hasn't won in this will be the 35th season if they don't win it this year. It's been 34 seasons since Notre Dame won a championship and now. And that's evidence they can't win. And so I have some data for you to back up that doesn't mean that they can't win. Clemson Tigers won a national championship in 2016. 34 seasons passed between that title and their previous title in 1981. The Georgia Bulldogs won a championship in 2021. Their previous championship was 1980, a streak of 40 seasons. LSU won a championship in 2003 under Nick Saban. It's their first title since 1958, a stretch of 44 seasons. Ohio State won a national championship in 2002 under Jim Tressel. Their previous national title was 1970, 31 seasons. And then they went another 11 seasons before their next title in 2014. Auburn went 52 seasons without a title, 1957 to 2010. Texas had 34 seasons between titles in 2005. Before that, their most recent championship was 34 seasons prior in 1970. So Alabama, here's an example. Alabama they won a national championship in 1979, and then Saban won his first in 2009. In between then, there's some bad Alabama football, and they won one title in that stretch in 1992. So a stretch of 29 seasons, they won one title. So when you look at that, again, not a good example of saying, well, because they haven't won in X number of years, and a lot of these that I pointed to are relatively recent titles. Clemson in 2016, Georgia in 2021, Ohio State in 2002, LSU in 2003, Auburn in 2010. those are all teams. Texas, obviously in '05. Those are all teams that are 2000 plus. I'm not even going back to 50 years ago when team won in 1983 that hadn't won since whatever the case may be. I'm not even doing that. I'm going in the last 15, 20 years we're talking about. So I don't think that's evidence either. That just means that you have not done what you needed to do to win during that period of time. And I think that has a lot more to say about it. There's also some teams that people are telling me are going to, have a chance to win a title in the next few years that are in the same boat as Notre Dame. Michigan is currently on a 25-year streak. They're going into year 26 right now without a championship. Their last title was in 1997, and that was a half a title. And the championship before that was 49 seasons prior in 1948. And they're considered a blue blood. Penn State has not won a title since 1986. Tennessee has not won a title since 1998. The title before that for Tennessee was 30 seasons prior in 1967. USC currently hasn't won a title in 18 years. They won back-to-back titles in 03 and 04. Their previous title before that was 1978. It's quite a stretch of I think it was like 24 seasons of no title. And I keep hearing that Texas A&M is a team to look out for the next few years because they have a shot to win a title. Do y'all know that World War II had not even started for the United States the last time Texas A&M won a national championship? 1938. Yet I keep hearing people tell me that they're capable of winning a title, but Notre Dame is not. There's no evidence that Notre Dame can. I think what we can all agree on, at the very least, is that it is harder at Notre Dame. And the current landscape, to me, does not necessarily make it harder. I think there's actually a lot of advantages for Notre Dame still that we hear constantly from recruits that make it work. So when I give you the list of schools that haven't won, I'm also trying to look, or teams that are on current stretches, or teams that I think that I am hearing from people that are capable of winning championships. It's been a while for Nebraska. I don't care about Nebraska. No one's arguing that Nebraska can win a title again. I'm talking about teams that right now I hear people saying, "Ooh, Tennessee, they're gonna have a chance to compete for a championship." USC, Penn State, Michigan, Texas A&M, teams like that haven't won titles in a long time. So I think that here's one thing that I also looked at, right? And I'll get into this actually in a second. Let me kind of dive into the reasons why, or the things that Notre Dame needs to do to win a title. So I think that Notre Dame can compete for a championship. I do. The it's been a long time thing is not evidence. That's a feeling. I gave the data. LSU, 44 years between titles. Georgia, 40. Ohio State, 31 before the Jim Tressel's title. Clemson, 34. Texas, 34. Auburn, 52. So to me, there's plenty of programs that have gone through droughts like Notre Dame has gone through. They've got to figure out answers to get out of the drought, right? That's the situation. So what does that mean? And I think that one aspect that we need to talk more about is something that is true for most schools. And that is teams that win are teams that have dynamic coaches in some form or fashion. Rarely do you see seasons like 2010 for Auburn, even a 2013 for Florida State to a degree, where you didn't really have a dynamic coach, but you had dynamic situation, dynamic players, dynamic quarterbacks, LSU in 2019. And so for me, when you look at a lot of these teams that had droughts, who broke the drought? It was a dynamic coach. Who broke the drought for Clemson? It was Dabo Swinney, who's a very dynamic coach. Who broke the streak for Ohio State? Jim Tressel, tremendous coach who'd won multiple national championships at the 1AA level in Ohio. Georgia, Kirby Smart, 40 years. Kirby Smart comes in, dynamic coach, saw what he did at Bama, leads him to a championship. Texas with Mac Brown, was that about the coach, or was that more of you went out and got a dynamic player? It's a quarterback. That's another factor. It's a factor in Auburn's titles, a factor in LSU's title in 2019. But in 2003, they won a title with Matt Mauck, I believe, at quarterback. So what was it? They hired Nick Saban, right? He led them to that championship. So when you look at the situations where and somebody says you've had situations where like Larry Coker won a title. Well, Larry Coker didn't win a title really. Butch Davis did, right? Butch Davis built that team. Larry Coker's job was don't screw it up, right? You need dynamic coaches. What got Miami turned around? Howard Schnellenberger, dynamic coach. Then Jimmy Johnson comes along. Jimmy Johnson was replaced by guys who weren't dynamic. They won off what he built. And then when his situation was basically run out of the program over time, they weren't good again. They bring in Butch Davis, got a coach for Jimmy. All of a sudden, they're good again. They've made bad hires since then. That's been their problem. So I think a big problem for Notre Dame is they just didn't hire the right coach. They hired a good coach in Brian Kelly that helped them get to a much higher level, a greater level of consistency, at least his last 5 years. But would you call Brian Kelly a dynamic coach that's going to go lead you to a championship? I do not. I do not think he's that type of coach. But he is a quality coach at the very least. And you saw what Notre Dame was capable of. 2 playoff appearances, played for another championship. So a program that from 1997 to 2010, with one exception, 05, was never even that, and that team lost 3 games, wasn't a title contender because why? They didn't have great coaches. Is Marcus Freeman that coach? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. We're going to find out, right? But this isn't so much about an argument that Marcus Freeman's going to win a title at Notre Dame. I hope that he does. It's whether or not Notre Dame can do it. So that's step one right there. Notre Dame needs to have a dynamic coach in order to win a championship. The exception to that rule was Dan Devine. But I will point to you again, that was a guy that was a quality football coach that inherited Eric Parsage's program. And that's why he was able to win. So I think that's step one. What is a dynamic? What does it mean to hire a dynamic coach? It's someone who has the ability to inspire his team, whether it be, and it can happen in all types of ways. A coach that is able to mentally get his teams ready to play in the biggest moments. I think when you look at the Urban Meyers and the Steve Spurriers and coaches like that, that's what they're able to do. And I think Florida is a perfect example of how a program that otherwise is not a really great program can be a great program with the right coach. Some numbers for you. Y'all know I love data. University of Florida started playing football in 1911. In that stretch since 1911, they've won 755 games. They've lost 438 games. They've had 40 ties. That is good for a winning percentage of 629. It's okay. Steve Spurrier, in his career at Florida, went 122-27 with one tie. It's an 817 win percentage, won a title in 96, played for 2 others. Lost to Nebraska, lost to Florida. Urban Meyer went 65-15, 813 win percentage, won 2 titles. All the other coaches that they've had since 1911 have combined to go 568 and 396 with 39 ties for a 586 win percentage. Florida's not a blue blood. They're not anything close to that. But twice in their career, in their tenures, over 100 years long, they've had a stretch of about a decade where they were a title contender. And both times with dynamic coaches who also had great success at other places. And that's basically where you look at and say that's the impact that a great coach can have. What was different at Notre Dame in between the Newt Rockne era, which their last title was in 1930, and the Frank Leahy era in 1943? Notre Dame had some years after that weren't great, right? There were stretches where they weren't a dominant football team. They had some good football teams. There's no doubt about that, but they weren't a dominant football team. And then they hire Frank Leahy, and Frank Leahy goes out and he wins, does a tremendous job. But Hank Anderson, he didn't win. Elmer Layden, he didn't win, not to the degree that we expect. You look at Hunk Anderson, 6-2-1, 7-2, 3-5-2. It's right after Newt Rockne passed. Elmer Layden takes over, played for Rockne, did a nice job, went 6-3, 7-1-1, 6-2-1, 6-2-1, 8-1, 7-2, 7-2. Had 3 top 10 finishes, did a nice job. And then in comes Frank Leahy, who was a phenomenal coach. And he wins, and they win 4 national championships during that stretch. And then you look at what happened with Coach Leahy after the Coach Leahy era. So Frank Leahy wins the national titles in 1943, 1946, 1947, 1949. In his last 2 seasons, Notre Dame finished 3rd and 2nd. And then after that, he gets replaced by Terry Brennan, and then Joe Kaharick, and then Hugh DeVore. And so Notre Dame wins a title in 1949. They win a stretch of about 14, 15 years under Terry Brennan, whose best year was 9-1 in his first year, and then progressively got worse, 8-2, 2-8, 7-3, 6-4. Joe Kaharick comes in, and Notre Dame, they go 5-5, 2-8, 5-5, and 5-5. Hugh DeVore coaches for a season, goes 2-7, and then in comes Ara Parseghian. And what does he proceed to do? He proceeds to be a great coach for the next 11 seasons, and Notre Dame wins 2 more national championships, and he becomes a Hall of Fame coach, right? Last won a title in 73, went 10-4, finished 6th overall, won the Orange Bowl in 74, and then retires. They win a title with Dan Devine, and then he's replaced by Jerry Faust, and Notre Dame is a bad program again. He gets replaced by Lou Holtz. They win a title. They go through a 5-year stretch where they're an elite program, and then all of a sudden they're not again. Right? So what is it? What is the resume for all that? Is it Notre Dame inherently creates champions, or did they hire elite championship caliber coaches that were able to build the program? It's about the coaches. Alabama didn't dominate because they have the best roster. They had the best roster because they had the best coach, right? Florida didn't win championships just because Florida is inherently a program capable of winning a title. They hired Steve Spurrier. They hired Urban Meyer. Outside of those tenures, Florida's an average, mediocre program for 100 years. Georgia wins a title in 1980, and let's be real about that title in 1980. They won that title in 1980 because they had one of the best players to ever play the game of football, ever, in Herschel Walker. But what did Florida do outside of that? Or what did Georgia do outside of that? They were a good program under Vince Dooley for a long time. But what was their previous national title prior to Herschel Walker showing up? Guys, it was 1942. It was the year after Pearl Harbor was bombed. That was the last time Georgia won a title. This isn't a program that inherently is good. Why are they good now? Is it because of, they pay? Georgia's always been willing to do that. Is it because they have some inherent built-in benefit? No, it's because they hired a great coach who's done a great job and he's built a great staff. That's the key ingredient. And that's part of being a great coach, a coach that can get you ready for the big games. That was a process of learning for Kirby Smart. What was the biggest issue that Kirby Smart had early in his career as a coach? It was, could his team win the big games? That was it. That was Kirby's problem. They went 8-5 in year one. And not a great year, not as good as Marcus Freeman's first year. I would argue that Coach Freeman inherited a slightly better situation just from a winning standpoint, but I would argue that Coach Smart inherited a better roster. They got the next year, they beat Notre Dame, and that was a quality win. But they lose to Auburn that year. They 2 overtimes against Oklahoma, but then they can't beat Alabama, right? They blow a lead against Alabama, and then they go out in 2018. Similar story. They can't win the big game. They lose to LSU on the road. They lose to Alabama that year in the SEC championship game. Can't get the job done. Go out in 2019. Same deal. Drop a bad game to South Carolina. Choke that game away. Go play LSU in the SEC title game. Get smacked, right? Can't win the big game. 2020. Georgia goes out, loses on the road to Alabama, loses in the rivalry game against Florida. And once again, a talented Georgia team can't win a big game. But Coach Smart continued to evolve. He continued to grow. He continued to improve himself as a coach. He come out in 2021. You get upset by Alabama in the SEC title game in a year where they had a pretty strong regular season. Obviously have a big win against Clemson, beat a highly ranked Kentucky team, beat a ranked Auburn team. Not a great schedule. Arkansas was decent that year, and then you go out in the postseason and you beat Michigan, and then you get your rematch against Alabama and you smack them, right? And then you come out in 2022. Not a ton of big games for Georgia last year, but the ones they had, they won. They won the big games. Not a incredibly challenging schedule, but look, Oregon was a quality team. They destroyed Oregon last year. They got those guys ready to play that game. They came into the Tennessee game, and I really thought Tennessee could have beat Georgia last year, and they completely outcoached them and outplayed them and outhit them. They smacked LSU in the title game. They beat Ohio State in the semifinal. So the whole notion that Coach Smart can't win the big games, all of a sudden it's gone, right? He changed it. And so I think it really comes down to there are a lot of programs capable of winning a title, but in almost every scenario, they were built by a dynamic coach. And so this notion that there are inherent things in Georgia that allow them to win, that make it so easy, is not backed up by evidence. There's no evidence that Georgia had these built-in inherent aspects that just any coach can kind of come in there and win, because from the end of World War II to 2021, they had one title in 1980 with one of the greatest players to ever play the game as the driving force behind that title. That's Herschel Walker. It takes away from their greatness. Alabama has never had a stretch like this, and it's easy to recruit. It is. Okay, well then why did they go from 1979 to 2009 and they only won one title? They had some pretty down years during that tenure as well. So to me, it always boils down to, in almost every instance, you need a dynamic coach. Now, you have some teams that kind of catch lightning in a bottle with the right player. LSU in 2019, Florida State 2013, with a great roster, weak schedule, great quarterback, 2010 with Cam Newton. But you need a dynamic coach, and Notre Dame hasn't had that type of coach in a long time. We don't know if Marcus Freeman's going to be that coach. I hope he is. I know that all the Notre Dame fans in here hope that he is. But we don't know if he's going to be that guy. A great coach has got to be a closer on the recruiting trail, and a great coach has to be able to build consistency. And I'm not talking about consistency of winning and losing. As you all know where I'm coming from on this. Consistency on the football field comes from consistency in how you go about your business on a daily basis. The process over the end result. If your focus is on the end result and not on the process, you're never going to get the results you're capable of. You have to be focused on the process. And the process is going to be the key. Can Marcus Freeman do that? Again, we don't know. But you can't tell me that Notre Dame is not capable of it. I'll give you a couple other reasons why I think that this notion that Notre Dame can't compete for a championship because of recruiting is also something that I reject. I'll explain that here in a second as well. We have seen in Notre Dame, I would argue, at least two Notre Dame teams that were a player here, a coach there away. I was talking with a former Notre Dame player today. I think it was a former Notre Dame player that I had this with. It might have been he and I might have been talking about something else. But I was having a conversation with him, or it was somebody recently that was affiliated with Notre Dame. And we were sitting there talking. And it was, the question that I raised was, what happens for Notre Dame in 2015 if you could just make two changes, zero to the roster? I'm not talking about Malik being healthy. I'm not talking about Jaron Jones not getting hurt. I'm not talking about Torian Folsom not getting hurt, Durham Smythe not getting hurt, John Crawford not getting hurt, none of that. CJ Prosise getting hurt late in the year. If only two things were different, Matt Bayless was running the strength program, and Mike Elko was a defensive coordinator. Those are the only two differences on that team. That team could have played with anybody, and they did. I mean, they took the national runners-up down to the wire. They took a great Stanford team that finished in the top 5 that year should have won that game. They shot themselves in the foot multiple times, including fumbling, DeShone Kizer fumbling late in the first half when they're about to go down and drive and score. When you look at late in the game, obviously you score with 30 seconds left, give it away, let them go back down and score. Then you look at what they did against Ohio State with basically a third of their starting roster out. Still were at least competitive in that game. I mean, it's a 28. You never thought Notre Dame was going to win it, right? I'm not saying that. But with all those injuries, they stayed in that game because they had dynamic players. That team was capable of it. The other conversation that I asked was this: what does Notre Dame look like in 2017 if they have A.J. Dillon and Josh Adams as your 1-2 punch and running back? What does their 2018 team look like if they've got A.J. Dillon and Dexter Williams as your 1-2 punch and running back? Well, here's the thing. I could play this game and say, well, what if, and I've done this before, what if in 2017 Notre Dame had Lamar Jackson instead of Brandon Wimbush? And no disrespect to Brandon Wimbush. I think Brandon Wimbush would tell you that Notre Dame would have been better with Lamar Jackson, I would think. But that's not a realistic thing. They were never in the game for Lamar Jackson, right? Who knows if they would have been able to get Lamar Jackson to Notre Dame if they even wanted him. I don't have the answer to that. But here's my point. If you just look at guys that they should have had, why did A.J. Dillon go to Boston College? Because the running backs coach at Notre Dame at the time told A.J. Dillon, you're a linebacker, not a running back. So then that linebacker goes to Boston College and rushes for almost 1,700 yards as a true freshman. That Notre Dame team in 2017, do we really think that they lose to Georgia in game 2 if they have A.J. Dillon and Josh Adams playing running back in that game? I don't know. They lost by 1 without A.J. Dillon. Who knows what that team turns out to be? Even if they lose to Miami, if they beat Georgia and lose to Miami in a close game, they're probably still a playoff team. I'd have liked to see that Notre Dame team with Josh Adams and A.J. Dillon against teams in the playoff that year. So we've seen Notre Dame put rosters together that were really dynamic. And the interesting thing is Brian Kelly recruited a lot more elite players in the first 6 or 7 years of his tenure than he did the last few. For those who obsess over recruiting rankings, when Clemson beat Notre Dame in 2015, Notre Dame had a higher ranked recruiting class in 4 of the 5 previous seasons. And they were usually by a significant amount. Here's another factor for you. Clemson, Notre Dame, 2015 teams. Notre Dame had more players that played on that team. And I don't mean guys that were redshirt freshmen or freshmen that didn't play. I'm talking about guys that were in the rotation and played some level of significant role. Notre Dame had more players from their 2015 team taken in the first 3 rounds of the draft than Clemson did. What was the difference? Better coaching and a more dynamic quarterback. So my point is, Notre Dame is not as far away as people think that they are, including some Notre Dame fans. And I had an Ohio State fan today on Twitter said, and it was a very fair conversation. He wasn't trying to flame, but he said Ohio State's light years ahead of Notre Dame. And there's a reason why that perception exists, because of how Notre Dame has been smacked in the mouth every time they've played for a title. But you can't tell me they're light years ahead when Notre Dame has played for the title 3 times in the last 11 seasons, right? They're certainly a better program. There's no question that Ohio State's a better program right now. Why? Because they made great coaching hires. Jim Tressel, and then that little bridge year with Luke Fickell, Urban Meyer, 2 Hall of Famers. Is Ryan Day a dynamic coach? I don't know the answer to that yet. We'll find out. I think Ryan Day, Jim Harbaugh was right about one thing, and I think even Ohio State fans should be willing to admit this. Ryan Day, from a coaching standpoint, was absolutely born on third base, right? Because of what he inherited for Urban Meyer. He inherited an established program. And so it comes down to the fact that, is Notre Dame where they need to be? Absolutely not. But the notion that I reject in this entire conversation is the notion that Notre Dame is as good as they can be. Under Brian Kelly, that was as good as they can be. And the answer is, I just don't agree with that. There's too much evidence to suggest that that's not true. Self-inflicted wounds on the recruiting trail. Self-inflicted wounds from a hiring personnel standpoint. There's too many opportunities that Notre Dame had to make good decisions that hurt them. you go back to the 2012 game. Somebody mentioned this game in the chat. I know for a fact that Luke Kuechly really wanted to be at Notre Dame. I shouldn't say fact. I was told by somebody very close situation that he flat out wanted to be at Notre Dame. So I actually took the initiative, and this is why I don't really do that anymore, to reach out to Notre Dame and through a contact that I had, say, hey, you need to tell them that this kid wants to come there. Notre Dame, John Tenuta said, no, we don't think he's good enough. We like Dan Fox better. So Notre Dame in 2009 could have had Luke Kuechly and Manti Te'o in the same class. I would have liked to have seen Notre Dame in 2012 matched up against Alabama with Luke Kuechly and Manti Te'o on the same team. I would have loved to have seen that. That'd have been a lot of fun to watch. So the point is, there's been plenty of opportunities for Notre Dame to go out there and do what they needed to do. They just have not been able to make the right choices. There's always, they're good enough here, but not here. And then they're good enough here another year, but not there. And so this notion that they're as good as they can be is part of that, of one of my biggest frustrations with Brian Kelly was Brian Kelly spent so much time convincing Notre Dame fans that this is the best that it can be, that I think a lot of people bought it. And I think a lot of people bought that the roadblocks are just too hard. It's just too challenging. And I don't agree that they are. I think they're roadblocks, but I would say they're not roadblocks. Brian Kelly convinced you that they're roadblocks. I will convince you that they're speed bumps. There are things you have to work to get over. You have to have a plan to get over them, but they're not things that prevent you from getting there, right? And so I reject that notion. I think if there are aspects that Notre Dame must do as an institution where they can provide better support, we've talked about those before. I don't want to repeat those. There are things Marcus Freeman needs to do to go out there and improve. And I think a perfect example of what I'm talking about is go look at offensive recruiting the last 2 years. Go look at it. You're recruiting quarterback at a high level. I'm going to have a little tidbit for y'all here on the message board about a certain player in the 2023 class, a freshman class, that is really doing well this summer. There's a lot of excitement about that class on offense with the receiver class and Jeremiah Love and the quarterback and the offensive line. The 24 class is loaded on offense, even with the loss of Isaiah Canyon. It's a really, really good offensive class. And what do they have to sell? What's the product that the Notre Dame offensive coaches have had to sell? We've had a very mediocre offense, and we haven't had a lot of guys drafted in the NFL. Our last two leading receivers, or actually our last three leading receivers at the wide receiver position. No, actually, Braden Lindsey was not Notre Dame's leading receiver last year, I don't believe. Let me just look at that real quick. Y'all know I like to try to have my data to be correct. No, he was not. He was not. He should have been, but he was not. So Notre Dame's last two leading receivers that went to the NFL didn't get drafted. Kevin Austin in 2021, Javon McKinley in 2020. And so Notre Dame hasn't had a first-round draft pick since the 2016 draft. And you say, well, why do they keep getting these really talented receivers? Well, how are they getting these really talented running backs? Notre Dame hasn't had I think the highest drafted running back they've had since Jerome Bettis was, and you had Dexter Williams in the 6th round, Carvin Williams in the 5th round. When was the last time Notre Dame had a big-time running back get drafted? Yet they're out there recruiting big-time running backs right now. Kedron Young is one of the best running backs Notre Dame has signed in 10 years. And if it wasn't for him, I'd be talking a lot more about Aeneas Williams. Jeremiah Love was a top 50 caliber player last year. Based on what? What is Notre Dame selling? Whatever it is, it's working. And the point that I'm making is you had a dynamic staff. You have a dynamic recruiting staff at those positions. And they're able to have a consistent message. And the message is being received. Now, eventually, they're going to have to put a good product on the field, right? We can all agree on that. But the message is working. The defensive staff has a much better situation to sell, but they're not selling it very well. So the recruiting isn't going very well. So that's the last part is the thing that's going to determine if Marcus Freeman can be that guy. He has to have the other traits that we talked about, the ability to prepare teams to mentally be ready to play, the consistency, all that other stuff that goes into being a great coach. But the one thing that we have to learn about with Coach Freeman is, can he make the tough decisions to get the staff where it needs to be? And again, I'm not talking about firing people. I'm talking about tough decisions are not always firing people. Sometimes it's having a very stern come to Jesus moment with an assistant coach. And that can be it too. But the answer is it has to get corrected. And we'll dive more into that in the next part of the conversation. But I look at this situation right now, and I really believe, and I could be wrong, when you look at the way Notre Dame recruited from about 17 to 21 with a great level of inconsistency, an unwillingness to truly fight for the big time players, the staff lost a little bit of ground, and we're seeing that in the NFL draft to a degree. The transfer portal has saved them in a couple instances. Notre Dame would have not been an 11-1 team in 2021 if not for Jack Cohn. Simple as that. They would not have been the team that they will be this year if not for the transfer portal because of those recruiting woes. But Coach Freeman is, in a lot of instances, fixing those. If he can take that next step to make sure that both sides of the ball are getting there, then he'll have that. And I think he's capable of it, because being a great closer on the recruiting trail is great for a head coach. But in order to close, you have to be in position to where you can win that battle, and that's going to come down to your assistants. And so we're going to find out if we win it. But moral of the story is, folks, I know that there's a lot of frustration. It's been 34 seasons. This is going to be year 35. But Clemson fans had been saying that for a long time as well. 1981, they win a title. They don't win another one until 2026. Ohio State wins one in 1970. They don't win another one until 2002. Georgia wins one in 1980. They don't win another one till 2021. So Notre Dame is still 6 years away from being where Georgia was going into 2021 when it comes to drought on a championship. 6 years away from being there. They are 10 years away from being where LSU was in their title drought before Nick Saban showed up. So I'm not saying I want to wait 10 more years, but what I'm saying is that should not lead you to lose hope that Notre Dame can be that team. You can't. Because what happens is when the fan base loses hope, the fan base lowers expectations. All of a sudden, 9-3 becomes something to get excited about. 10-2 is something to get excited about. You beat Ohio State, but you get your butt kicked by USC and Clemson. Hey, but at least we beat Ohio State. You start getting those excuses. Brian Kelly was the master of that, right? Well, hey, we lost to every good team we played, but we were competitive with all of them. Remember that when you said that in 2015? Notre Dame went 1-3 against ranked teams that year. Only win, Navy. But we were convinced that that was great because they were close wins. We heard the Notre Dame head football coach say after the 2020 playoff that, hey, we lost to Alabama by fewer points than Ohio State lost to Alabama. And so you start lowering the bar about what this team can be. And I think some Notre Dame fans have embraced it. My hope is that I can convince you to get rid of that. Because once we embrace a lower standard, then the school has the ability to accept and embrace a lower standard. The administration can do that if they so choose. The football coach, if you have someone like a Brian Kelly, is more willing to say, you know what, 10-2 is pretty good. And I think that part of the reason that this is my opinion, I have not been told this by anybody. I'm just trying to read between the tea leaves. I think if Jack Swarbrick wanted his legacy to be for Notre Dame to be what it was under Brian Kelly, which is just consistently good, he would not have hired Marcus Freeman as head coach. If Jack Swarbrick cared about just being good and then occasionally making that run for your playoff team, but you get smacked, he'd have made a hard run at Luke Fickell, which he didn't. He'd have made a hard run at Dave Clawson. He'd have made a hard run at several coaches that fit that mold. Good quality coaches that could come to Notre Dame and win you 9-10 games a year and occasionally get you to a playoff berth. You don't hire Marcus Freeman to do that because he's the coach that's least qualified to get you there. He's the ultimate boomer bust coach. If Marcus Freeman's not ready for this job, your program takes a step back. If Marcus Freeman does have the chops that I believe Jack Swarbrick thinks that he has, then you know we may stub our toe for a year or two, hopefully only one. But if this guy is who I think he is, he's going to take us to the next level. We don't know if he's right or wrong about that. But I believe that Jack Swarbrick believes that because I think Jack Swarbrick understands to win at Notre Dame, you need a dynamic coach. And I think that he believes in time, Marcus Freeman can be that coach. I just hope it's not too much time. So that's my hope, is that as Notre Dame fans, we can get rid of this notion of you can't win. We can embrace the challenges. The challenges are what make Notre Dame unique. It's the difference between a head coach like Brian Kelly, who constantly complains about how the academic rigors and the admission standards make it harder at Notre Dame, and a coach like Lou Holtz, who says, no, fellas, that's not only not an excuse, those things are why you will be a champion. Go talk to Notre Dame players from the Lou Holtz era. They'll tell you that part of the things that they had to do away from the football field are things that those coaches sold as, if you buy into this, this is going to actually make you better, make you stronger. Because, hey, you think anybody else is out here doing what you're doing? Do you think anybody else is having to take midterms the way you are, taking these classes and taking this course load and putting in this work and doing this and doing that? Nobody is doing that. Nobody's doing that. But what he said is, this isn't something that's going to keep you from beating Miami. These are the things that are going to be why you beat Miami. And if Marcus Freeman can be that guy and be that type of coach that says, no. We're not using that as an excuse anymore. We're not using the whole, well, our kids have traveled a lot. That's why we're not playing well. That's why we lost to Miami. That's why we lost to Stanford. That's why we did this. Our kids were worn down. No. This is why you're going to win, because nobody's working like you are. If Coach Freeman and his staff can embrace that, then I believe he'll win. If he's not willing to embrace that and he allows those excuses to kind of creep up, then he'll falter and he'll fall short. And then hopefully his replacement will be that guy. But I believe Jack Swarbrick thinks he is that coach. We'll find out if he's right or wrong. I don't know the answer to that, but I am very much looking forward to finding out. Let's get into part 2 of our show, and that is going to be, we're going to do sort of a state of recruiting look at where the Notre Dame program is right now. And we're going to talk about defensive recruiting because I've had several conversations with people. Obviously, things are not going great with defensive recruiting right now. And the concern is that this has been the side of the ball that has really carried the team for a while. And so I want to kind of have an honest talk about where Notre Dame is right now with their program when it comes to defensive recruiting, where they are, where they're coming from, and then what needs to happen for this team to get better. So let's look a little bit about where Notre Dame is right now. When you look at really the last 2 classes plus the one that they're working on now, 2024. And we're going to start up front because this is a very interesting conversation. When you look at the defensive line recruiting, it's kind of fascinating because there's a lot to be frustrated about. We've talked about this. The Justin Scott situation, some other losses, losing Jason Moore, a player that you were the leader for some time. There were a lot of things that you looked at and said, man, you gotta win that battle. But that's one way to look at recruiting, and that's one way to evaluate your coaches. And in that regard, Coach Washington has to start winning some of those battles. If you then take yourself away from that part of the conversation, which is, hey, you got to do better here, and you simply look at what the talent acquisition has been, you see a little bit of a different story. And when you look at it, and you look at what Notre Dame has been able to add the last couple of seasons on the defensive line, going back to 2022, I would argue that Notre Dame came up probably a player short. I think they would have liked a 4th defensive lineman in that class. But when you look at what they got some pretty good football players. Aiden Gobira finished that season as a top 100 player, according to Rivals. He finished that year as the number 84 player in the country, according to Rivals. Tyson Ford, during his tenure at Notre Dame, finished the season as a number 51 overall player in the country on Rivals, and ranked number 98 on the On3 composite ranking. Brought in Donovan Heinisch. He's more of a program guy, a lot like his brother, a little more talented version of his brother, not a highly ranked guy, but a guy that you look at and say that kid's got some ability. He's going to be able to help this football team, whether it's as a rotation guy or an underachieving starter underrated starter, that overachieves based on what his perception is based on his recruiting rankings. Then you look at the 2022 class, the 2023 class. And I've said this before. If you look at the Notre Dame 2023 class and you focus on what they lost, there's a lot to be frustrated about, guys that they've lost. But then I've said this again, I'll say it again now. You have to be willing to have two conversations when it comes to the future of a position. And the two conversations have to be a combination of what you lost and how you need to get better at those type of players. And then you need to be able to have a conversation about what you have and what you landed. And when you look at last year's class, you have Brendan Vernon finished his career ranked number 66th overall, according to Rivals.com. You have Boubacar Traore, who is a consensus 4-star recruit, finished his career despite missing a chunk of his senior season, finishes ranked as high as number 142 by 247, and again, ranks number 208 on the composite list or consensus list on On3. Devin Houston, on the On3 consensus, top 250 player. ESPN ranks him as the number 164 player in the country, consensus 4-star recruit. And then you have Armel Mukam, who 247 Sports ranks as the number 191 player in the country. That's pretty good. Armel Mukam is your 4th lowest ranked player. You fast forward to this year, and you look at some of the players they have in the class and say, you lose Justin Scott, you lose this player over here, you lose that player over there. But then you actually look at the class and you say, there's some things to be excited about with this class. I know some of them aren't from a recruiting ranking standpoint. Some of them will be, which I'll get to. But there's a lot of talent there. And I've made my point known about Cole Mullins, for example. He's a consensus 3-star recruit. And I'm as adamant about Cole Mullins is going to be a really good player at Notre Dame as I was about Benjamin Morrison, that I was about Isaiah Foskey, that I was about Jeremiah Usu-Koramoah. I believe he's that kind of player. You look at a guy like Bryce Young. He's ranked as the number 237 player in the country by On3. You look at Logan Thomas. He's ranked as the number 101 player in the country by On3. Every single service has him at least in the top 250, and he's ranked in between 101 to 231. And he's not even close to tapping into his full potential. I'm not as high on Sean Sevillano, so that's a conversation for another day. But then you look at 2025, and you look at Davion Dixon. Again, another top 200 player. So they need to get more wins. They have to get more wins. They have to stop having these unforced errors. But when you also look at the foundation of what they have, there's good football players there. The question is, can they take it to the next level from a development standpoint? I would argue this. For all the issues that we have with Al Washington as a recruiter, and we have them, here's the question that I'll pose to Notre Dame fans. If you knew that Al Washington was at the very least going to be as good of a coach as Mike Elston, would you be as down on this recruiting as we are? I don't know that I would. Part of my thing is I don't know what kind of coach Al Washington is. We have to find out. I said in the show we did last week, I need to see what he can do in year 2 without some of the issues that were going on with some of the veterans. How is he going to handle this younger roster? Can he build on what we saw in the spring? I don't know the answer to that. I hope so, because there is some talent there. But I hear people say, well, I don't know if Notre Dame has the talent on defense, on the defensive line to go out and win. I said, well, a lot of solid players. And I'm like, well, aren't you someone who obsesses over recruiting rankings? Yeah, recruiting rankings mean a whole lot. Oh, okay. Well, wasn't Riley Mills a pretty highly ranked player coming out of high school in 2020? And wasn't he a consensus 4-star player that was considered one of the best kids in that class? I believe that he was. Wasn't Jordan Patel a very highly ranked player coming out of high school? I believe that he was. Riley Mills, for example, was ranked number 141 player in the country by ESPN and number 155 by Rivals. You look at Jordan Patel, ranked as high as number 65 by 247 Sports, 176 by Rivals, 182 by ESPN. You look at Javonte Jean-Baptiste, again, a guy that was a quality rotation player for the Buckeyes. But you look at him as a recruit coming out of high school. If you're someone who cares about such things, Javante Jean-Baptiste was ranked as the number 127 player in the country by 247 Sports coming out of high school, and was number 132 on the composite rankings. So, 219 on the composite rankings coming out. He was number 201 on the consensus rankings from On 3. That's another guy that was ranked very high coming out of high school. We talked about Gabriel Rubio coming out of high school. Gabriel Rubio is a kid who was a top 100 recruit. I know that SI 99 had him as I think a number 50 player in the country coming out of high school. He was ranked number 107 by Rivals. There are a lot of guys on this roster that were ranked very high. Josh Burnham, coming out of high school as part of the 2022 class, was a top 100 recruit. He is one of the best athletes that Notre Dame has on their roster right now at this point in time. He finished his career ranked as the number, I believe, 86, 84 player in the country, 76 by 247 Sports. The lowest ranking for Josh Burnham was number 167. He's got to learn a new position. He's very talented. Junior Tuihalamaka is another kid that was, I believe, a borderline top 100 recruit by at least one of the recruiting services. He was ranked he wasn't borderline. He was number 95 player in the country by ESPN. So when you look at where they are, there's actually a lot of talent. The question is, we don't know what kind of coach Al Washington is going to be. We're going to find out this year, though. And so I believe that if we can look at if he can go out and prove himself as a coach this year, I think even if the recruiting results don't change, the perception of the players they're getting does. I think if there was a perception that Al Washington could develop players, that a lot of you would look at Cole Mullins a lot differently. You'd look at Logan Thomas a lot differently. You'd look at Bryce Young a lot differently. If Mike Elston was still here, who was a quality developer of defensive linemen, I think we would look at the same exact recruits much differently because there's a known commodity recruiting them. If Coach Freeman would have hired a defensive line coach that we knew more about, that was more of a proven defensive line coach, we would look at it differently. And that's the thing that Al Washington has to improve. Somebody asked me yesterday, what can he do to change the perception? My answer was simple. Go put a great product on the field. Show that you can coach. Show that you can coach, and people are going to change their perception. I think that's what Al Washington needs to do. And so I think that Notre Dame is in a better position baseline-wise than a lot of people think. The question, however, is, are you going to have a 2018 type of offensive line, which was very good, but not 2021 Georgia good? Can you get to 2018 at least? That's still a question, because some of those guys in that 2018 class were highly ranked guys. Dalen Hayes was, for example. Julian Ekwara was a 4-star kid. Jerry Tillery is a 4-star kid. Khalid Kareem was a 4-star kid. But they were developed. If Al Washington and Al Golden can develop the talent they have, then the opinion of all this starts to change. And so I think that's where they are right now. And that's where if Al Washington, if I could sit down and have a conversation with Al Washington and he actually cared what I think, it would be do that and then keep recruiting the dudes that you missed on. Because if you can put the product on the field, then maybe you'll have a chance to go back there and get some of those guys. But otherwise, focus on the 25 class. And that's where Notre Dame really is right now from a state and recruiting standpoint, is there's a lot of talent on the current roster. It's very good talent. It's not elite talent, at least not yet. There's some elite upside guys there. I think Riley Mills could be that guy. I think Josh Burnham can be that guy. I think Tyson Ford can be that guy, just physical talent-wise. I think that Boubacar Traore and Armo Mukum can be that guy. I think Brandon Vernon could be very good. I have Cole Mullins as a very high upside kid. I'm actually going to change his grade soon to 5-star upside after I haven't had a chance to. I changed his current grade. I moved him up to the top 100 after I found some game film. I'd seen some game film, but I found a couple other some film of games that allowed me to kind of see him even a little bit more, answered a couple of the questions that I had. So his upside grade is going to go up as well. Logan Thomas has tons of upside. And so if you can develop it, you're going to have a heck of a product, which then makes it a lot easier to sell to the next Justin Scott, the next Elijah Rushing, the next Jason Moore, the next Keon Keeley. Because at the end of the day, as much as I like the talent that they have now and that they've recruited recently, the way to truly make winning easier, to widen the margin for error, because right now it's still tighter for Notre Dame than it is the other top programs. It's not as tight as it used to be, but it's still a lot smaller. The margin for error is a lot smaller than it is for Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State. What does that mean? Just in case you're wondering, margin for error means a guy doesn't develop, a guy gets hurt, a coach doesn't quite make the right calls. He's not a great coach. Can you overcome those things and win still at a high level? If you're a program where you've got Sam Hartman as your starting quarterback, but major questions as your number 2 and number 3, your margin for error is very small. You better hope Sam Hartman doesn't get hurt. If you're a team that has Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Hurts, and Mac Jones on the same roster, your margin for error at quarterback is incredibly big. And that's the point. That's what I'm talking about. Much wider from margin for, and quarterback's an example that you can point to, but same with defensive line. If Georgia loses Nolan Smith this past year, which they did, year before they lost, what was it, Anderson? I think his first name was Adam Anderson. See, you guys know me. It's going to drive me nuts. Just let me look real quick and make sure that I got the kid's name right. But he was their best pass rusher in 2021. He gets kicked off the team, and so they go out and they're just fine. They go out and they still continue to win. Where can Adam Anderson? Yeah, I was right. I need to trust myself sometimes more. Then you're gonna win. You're gonna be successful. And so when you're able to land that type of talent with the depth, then the margin for error is much wider. Right now, Notre Dame has a smaller margin for error. If they lose Javonte Jean-Baptiste or he's not as good as I hope, I don't love the depth chart at big end. There's good quality rotation guys, but there's not as many difference makers after him. They need to be rotation guys, and then thrusting them into starting lineups doesn't do good for them. I love Nana Osafo-Mensah as a rotation guy. I think he brings a lot of value as a leadership standpoint, from a character standpoint, from a run defensive standpoint, can give you a pass rush in certain looks and certain pinches, but he's a guy that is a good come off the bench guy. He's not as good if he's your number 1 45, 50 snaps a game guy. So you need Javonte Jean-Baptiste. That's where they've had some failures. At other positions, you're a little better than you are. But if Mike Riley Mose goes down and Gabriel Rubio has to step in, Gabriel's a pretty good player, but now the depth behind him is a little shakier. And that's kind of what I'm referring to when I talk about margin for error. Notre Dame's margin for error is still smaller and tighter than it has been in the past. And so they're going to have to figure out a way to improve there. And that's where the Keon Keeley's come into play. That's where the Jason Moore's come into play. That's where the Justin Scott's come into play. That's where, you're getting these guys that have tons of talent, but guys that can be elite players. And then it also puts you in a situation where if you have a Keon Keeley and you have a Jason Moore, let's just say starting at big end, then all of a sudden Cole Mullins and Josh Burnham and guys like that can kind of come along a little bit more slowly, because now Josh has one more year to get more comfortable as a defensive end, because you've got Keon and Jordan Patelho and those type of guys. And so now you need Josh Burnham to be ready a little faster than maybe otherwise would have, when you consider he's making a transition from linebacker and quarterback, which he played in high school, to defensive end, which is a nuanced position in a lot of ways. And I think so that's where you get down to what the margin for error is. And Notre Dame is not there yet. They've got to get better there. And that's what the big time players can bring you. You don't need to always have the right call when Keon Keeley's your Viper. You don't need to always have the right call when Khalid Kareem is your big end, because if the game's on the line, Khalid's going to find a way to win. He was just a winner. I mean, his numbers were never phenomenal. He was a 5.5 sack guy. But if you look at every sack he had, it was like strip sack for a touchdown against Stanford, game-winning sack game-clinching sack against Michigan, game-clinching sack against Pitt. They were clutch And so you need more guys like that. And that's what we don't know that they have. And they've got to go get those guys. That's true at the defensive line position. It's true at safety. That's another position where you say, look, they're actually getting some quality players. In a 4-year stretch, you've got Ben Minich, you've got Don Schuler, Bronte Johnson, and Kennedy Urlacher. That's not bad. There's been a lot of years in the past that's not as good they haven't done as well recruiting. But it's the misses that are the problems, and it's the misses you should not be missing on. That's the problem. And so I think when you look at it, say, boy, this guy's got some ability as a coach, but he can't recruit. And that's the interesting thing between Chris O'Leary and now Washington is I think Chris O'Leary being here for a second season has kind of proven he's got some chops a little bit as a coach, just not a very good recruiter. With Coach Washington, we don't know. Somebody asked me, why are you harder on Al Washington than you are Chris O'Leary? And I said, I don't agree with the premise, but if I were to accept the premise, I would say that with Chris O'Leary, he's a little bit more known for me as a defensive line coach or safeties coach at Notre Dame than Al Washington is, because Al Washington's been here for 1 year. Chris O'Leary's been here for 2. And I think Al Washington can get on that level if he can go out there and put a really great product on the field, because he's got some tools to work with. But safety is another position where Notre Dame has to be more consistent recruiting that position. Give me the Ben Miniches, give me the Adon Schulers, give me the Brontes, give me the Kennedy Urlachers, but I need you to also start getting the Jalen McClains, the Xavier Nwangpas, the Peyton Bowens. You need to start winning those battles at that position. Or you need to be able to be like what Mike Mickens is, where if I'm not going to win those battles, I'm going to go find the Leonard Moores. I'm going to go find these guys with very high ceilings. And here's another example. Nobody's complaining about Mike Mickens' recruiting right now. Nobody. Even the people that obsess over recruiting rankings are not at all complaining about the job Mike Mickens is doing right now. If you go back and look, if you just look at recruiting rankings and you compare corners and you compare defensive linemen in the 24 class, Al Washington has a higher ranked player than Mike Mickens does. Matter of fact, he has 2 players ranked higher than what Leonard Moore is. Bryce Young is ranked higher on the consensus list, and so is Logan Thomas. But why do we not have the same concern about cornerback recruiting with 2 3-star recruits in the class? It's number one, I think some of you, because you trust me, and I love Leonard Moore, and at least one recruiting service has him in the top 200 rivals. But number 2, more than your trust of me, you trust Mike Mickens. You trust the track record to take guys that are not great recruits but have talent and then turn them into big-time players. That's where it comes down to. There's a trust factor there that I know he can identify a lowly ranked kid and turn him into a stud. He did it with Nick Johnson at Bowling Green. He did it with Sauce Gardner at Cincinnati. He did it with Kobe Bryant at Cincinnati. He did it with Nick McLeod. He did it with Clarence Lewis. Then turned him into a stud, but he turned him into a starter on a playoff team. He's done it with Cam Hart, and he did it with Benjamin Morrison. So there's a trust factor there that he has proven to me that those lower ranked recruits he signs, he can turn into dudes. So when Mike Mickens goes out and gets a Cole Mullins, which he did in Leonard Moore, we trust that he's going to be a good player because we trust Mike Mickens. Coach Washington has not earned that trust with Notre Dame fans so far because he's only been here for a year. Mike Mickens didn't have all of y'all on board until last year when he turned Benjamin Morrison into what he turned Benjamin Morrison into. Although I would argue what he did in 2020 with Nick McLeod and Clarence Lewis was every bit as good as what he did last year with Cam Hart and Benjamin Morrison, if not better, because the talent's not as good as it is now. So I think there's that to it as well. I think that's a part of it. I think that those coaches have to prove that. And then linebacker recruiting to me is actually the biggest question mark for me. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the current roster, Notre Dame's roster at linebacker is really good. You've got the veterans. We've talked about them. But behind them, you've got Jalen Sneed. You've got Nolan Ziegler. You've got Drake Bowen. You've got Jaden Osbury. You've got Preston Zinter. Very talented players. The question is, that was Marcus Freeman's doing. Can Al Golden and Max Buller, whoever's in charge of linebacker recruiting moving forward, can they bring in those type of players? And there's a question there. And then there's also the question of development. If Marcus Freeman was still the defensive coordinator, there'd be a greater level of trust about what Bodie Cahoon and Teddy Rizak can be. Because you just said, well, hey, hold on a second. If Coach Freeman likes these guys, and we know he can coach, and we know he's this and he's that, I'm going to trust him. But Al Golden hasn't won that trust over, nor should he at this point in time win our trust over in that regard. And so you have to ask yourself, are they going to take a step back from linebacker recruiting, which had been a very inconsistent position for years, that Marcus Freeman kind of turned around quickly? Can they get back to that? Is Al Golden capable of it? Is Max Bulla capable of it? If Al Golden goes back to the NFL, will Coach Freeman hire someone that's capable of doing that at a high level at linebacker? Those are all fair question marks. So right now, I believe that the defensive recruiting is better than a lot of us are giving it credit for. I love the talent of what they have. There's a lot of upside. There's a lot of God-given ability. They're not going to blow people away with rankings, at least not national rankings. Bronte Johnson's not my number one ranked recruit in the 24 class, by the way, and I have him as a top 100 player. Cole Mullins is. But it's the misses and the way they've missed that's a problem. So when you look forward to 2025, it's hard for Notre Dame fans to get fired up right now, because what y'all see is a board at linebacker that is absolutely flipping loaded. You see a defensive line board that's pretty good and growing. You see a safety board that's got some really good players on it. But you kind of look at it and say, man, I'm not sure how I'm feeling about this position, because I don't know if this guy can land those guys. I mean, you talk about linebacker, there's about 6 guys that if you land 3 of those, you've got a top 5 linebacker class, if not better. But the question is, can Al Golden do that? Can Max Bulla do that? That's the question. And that's what this next really year is going to be about. But the first thing that they can do is focus on the team. Get this team to play at a high level, because it's a lot easier to sell something to recruits if nothing changes in your operation. When the product you have on the field is dynamic, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to sell to people. And so we'll have to find that out. And we're going to find that out here over the next really 5-6 months. And that's going to be a fun part of it. So state of the defensive recruiting right now, to wrap up, it's in flux. It's got potential, but big questions. Is it trending in the right direction? Or are you still living off of some coaches that are no longer in those positions that brought in kids? What happens if you lose Mike Mickens in a year because he gets a defensive coordinator job? There's a lot of concerns right now, but there's also a lot of talent on the board. And if they can get that talent on the board to play at a high level, this team is going to be a lot of fun to watch. And I think Notre Dame fans are going to enjoy that very much. We're going to wrap this part up. We're going to have another conversation here at the end where we're going to talk about some non-conference games that are going to impact college football this season. And there's going to be several in Notre Dame that we're going to talk about. But before we do, folks, do me a favor and hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. And if you have not done so, sign up for the message board at boars.irishbreakdown.com. We are less than 100 subscribers away from reaching the goal that I had set for our message board for the 2024 season. We're less than 100 subscribers away from that now. So if you haven't signed up yet and you've been thinking about it, but you just haven't been able to pull the trigger, do it. I've already had 3 or 4 conversations with sources, getting some intel on the team and all that. So I'm all putting it all together. We'll have that out in the next couple of weeks as well. You're definitely not going to miss out on that, but that's only going to be on the message board. It's not going to be in the show. It's not going to be on a story. It's going to only be on the message board. So make sure you check that out at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Last part of today's show, we're going to talk about the 10 biggest games non-conference games in college football this season that could have the biggest impact on who plays for a national championship. This is going to be a little bit fun. When I looked at the schedule, there are and I started looking at some of the top teams. You got a little discouraged, like, man, like Michigan doesn't play anybody out of conference. Georgia doesn't play anybody out of conference. And so, it's because this series was canceled and that series was canceled. Whatever the case may be, the schedules are not strong out of conference. And then you start studying other teams and you're like, man, there are actually some really good non-conference games. And there's one particular weekend that is going to have 4 games that we're going to talk about this in one weekend, which I'm very, very much looking forward to. And that's going to be a whole lot of fun. So here are 10 games, 10 non-conference games that could have a big impact on who plays for national title this season in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And we're going to go down through this sort of by date. And of course, there's always upsets that could happen, but I'm not talking about 2 quality teams where a statement can be made either by a conference or a team. And so let's start with this. The first game we're going to talk about is on August 31st. The Florida Gators head out to Salt Lake City to play Utah. This is a rematch of last year's game. And I think this is a big game. And you could also choose Utah's game the next week at Baylor, but I think this one is bigger. And here's why I think this is a big game. I don't know that either Utah or Florida have a chance to play for a national title this year. Matter of fact, if I was betting right now, I would say I don't think either of them are going to be playoff teams this year. But here's why I think this game is going to have an impact. When you look at Florida at Utah, this is more of a statement game for the Pac-12. And I have a couple other games that are going to be similar to this. Sometimes it's the game that's played not by your champion that can have an impact. And here's what I mean by this. When you look at Utah, for example, back-to-back Pac-12 champs, won it 2 years in a row. And you look at their schedule this season, they have some really tough non-conference teams. And you look at actually the Pac-12 in general has some really tough non-conference games. But if a team like Utah is able to go out and beat Florida, who I think is going to be an okay team this year, not great, it's a statement game. Kind of like when Georgia smacked Oregon last year. When Georgia beat Oregon the way they did last year, it put a black eye on the whole conference. Like it or not, it put a black eye on the whole conference. This is an opportunity for the Pac-12 to earn a big victory over a SEC East opponent, to where if Utah wins the league at 12-1, it gives them a resume that says we're a playoff team. If Utah doesn't win the Pac-12, it will then, a little bit through the transitive property, will change the perception of the Pac-12 so that when USC or Oregon or Washington or Oregon State or whoever wins the Pac-12 beats Utah, you're going to say, that is impressive. Because here's what's been great and really cool about Utah's titles the last 2 years. They had to beat the next best team twice, both years, to win the title. They beat Oregon twice in 2021, and they beat USC twice last year, which is impressive. So now all of a sudden, USC, let's say USC is the best team in the Pac-12. And let's just say hypothetically that USC loses to Notre Dame, and that's how they get to 12-1, just for argument's sake, because we'll get to that game here in a little bit. If they beat Utah and they beat Oregon, and they beat these teams, and those teams have really good non-conference wins, the perception of that USC win over Utah, if Utah can smack Florida, because it's not even just about beating Florida. If Florida's not a great team in the Pac-12, you can't just beat them. You got to smack them. Let's say Utah beats Florida convincingly, just for argument's sake. Now, all of a sudden, when a team in the Pac-12 beats Utah, that means a lot more nationally. Whoa, Utah jumped way up in the rankings after smacking Florida and beating Baylor in back-to-back games. They beat Weber State. Utah starts 3-0. They beat UCLA at home. They go on the road and beat Oregon State. They beat Cal at home. And all of a sudden, Utah is ranked 9th. And then they go to USC, who's going to be ranked high at the time, most likely. And I believe that is a week before USC plays Notre Dame. It is not correct. It's the week after they play Notre Dame. Let's say they lose to Notre Dame. USC is now ranked below Utah, who's undefeated. All of a sudden, USC beats Utah the week after losing to Notre Dame, and they get all their momentum back because Utah is undefeated. They smacked an SEC team, and they're ranked in the top 10. Let's say Utah beats USC and knocks USC out. USC's got 2 losses now. They're out. The next week, Oregon travels to Utah. They're going to have opportunity to be a highly ranked team. So either A, Utah earns another big win that builds their resume, or B, Oregon builds their resume by beating Utah. And then a couple weeks later, Utah goes out to Washington for a similar scenario. So that's why I think that Florida game is going to lay a foundation for the Big 12, the Pac-12, if they can win it. And if they lose, then that's a big statement win for the SEC. Not that they need any, but it is, because now if they can rack up the non-conference wins, it's if you have a 12-1 runner-up in the SEC, or even an 11-2 runner-up in the SEC, and you're going up against a 1 or 2 loss Pac-12 champ for a chance to get that 4th bid, and you're number 2 in the SEC against a champion in the Pac-12 or the Big 12, and we'll get to that as well, then all of a sudden you're going to have a better resume because all of a sudden your league went out of conference and handled its business. The inverse is true, right? The reverse is true. If the Big 12 and the Pac-12 can earn some big wins over the SEC and they'll have their chances, then all of a sudden you have opportunities to say, hey, we deserve that bid. Not only are we the champs, but our conference handled its business against the SEC. I think that's really big. And for the Big Ten as well, we'll get into that a little bit also. So let's go to, that would be August 31st. Let's move forward to September the 3rd. I believe this is a Sunday. Let me pull this up real quick because I believe this is a Sunday game. And it is a game between, let me find it here, folks. Give me 1 second. If any of y'all ever use FBS schedules, it can be very annoying because they always give you these ads that pop up that slow down your attempt to look at schedules. So it is a Sunday game, Sunday, September 3rd. Camping World Stadium, Orlando, Florida. Number 7 LSU, this is preseason ranking, takes on number 3 Florida State. This is a huge game, one of the biggest games of the season in conference or out of conference. I am very much looking forward to this game. Obviously, there's the storylines, the rematch game. Obviously, Florida State beat LSU last year in New Orleans. This is a chance for them to kind of get a payback. It's a chance for LSU to say, hey, we are legit contenders. But it's even more so true for Florida State. And then the byproduct of that is, what would it say for the ACC if Florida State can win this game again? When you look at Florida State this year, you're talking about a team that had some really good wins last year, a team that went 10-3, beat LSU, beat Oklahoma in a bowl game. Oklahoma wasn't that good. Beat Florida at the end of the year. But I think they're still destroyed Miami, destroyed Syracuse. But I think there's still a lot for them to prove. This is also a team, for all those big wins, that lost at home to Wake Forest by 10, that lost on the road to NC State, and lost again to Clemson, a team that has been dominated by Clemson. I think, 2013, I think, is the last time that Florida State beat 2014 is the last time that Florida State beat Clemson. So this is a chance for them to say, hey, statement win, we are legit. Because everybody's hyping up LSU as a chance to go out and win a title. Right? And so to me, real quick, someone said Florida State's overrated because they lost the only good teams on the schedule. So just found out that LSU wasn't very good last year. Good to know. But this is a huge opportunity for them because LSU is a preseason top 10 team. They are the reigning SEC West champs. They did beat Bama last year to make a statement win for Florida State. It's also a statement win for the ACC. And there's going to be a couple opportunities for the ACC to have those. You look at the first weekend as well. There's South Carolina versus North Carolina. Not one of my top 10 games, but when you look at it, it's just a chance for the ACC to go out and get some of those wins. The ACC last year had a golden opportunity in several games to go out there and get some big wins over the SEC, and they lost a bunch of them. Really dropped the ball on that opportunity. They get another crack at it this year. This is one of those games. I think what this game also does is this game gives Florida State an opportunity to go out and say, hey, we are a team that is going to go out and be a playoff contender, even if we drop a game. Here's what I mean. Florida State's schedule this year is pretty challenging, and I definitely respect the schedule. And games in September matter as much as they do other times. If you lose in September, it doesn't mean that it's not a good win. That's nonsense. The Florida State win over LSU last year was a very impressive win last year for a team that won 10 games. But they go out this year, if they can win that game, then 3 weeks later they play at Clemson. That's a tough game. Let's say Clemson gets that W in a competitive game. Then they go out, they beat Virginia Tech, they beat Syracuse, they beat Duke, they beat Wake Forest, they beat Pitt, they beat Miami, they beat North Alabama, they beat Florida. I don't expect any of those teams to be great. I think Miami might have a shot to be ranked. Pitt might have a shot to be ranked. Florida might have a shot to be ranked. Duke has a shot to be ranked. But I don't think any of those are going to be statement wins. So if you lose to Clemson and you beat LSU, you're in a situation where you're still living off that LSU win. So you're going to be in striking distance for a playoff spot going into the ACC title game, most likely in a rematch against Clemson. If you're LSU, if you're Florida State, beating Clemson twice and LSU is going to be incredibly hard. So then you get into the whole, well, okay, what if you lose to LSU, beat Clemson, then you got to beat Clemson again. That's going to be hard. So if you're going to lose one of those 2 games, it's beat LSU, drop the game to Clemson, not drop it like you're going to lose it, but if you get beat by Clemson in a competitive game, you got a rematch coming against Clemson. And I always think that you want to be the team going in those matchups that lost earlier. Of course, Utah was the exception because they've done it twice in a row now where they've beat the team again. But I think this is a different situation because Clemson's not Oregon or USC. So Florida State, if they can beat LSU, can go 1-1 against Clemson, be 12-1 because all their other games are against teams I think they're better than. And all of a sudden, Florida State's a playoff team. If you lose to LSU, you're basically in a single elimination mode. You've got to probably beat Clemson twice, including a game on the road. Neither of those games are being home. One's at Clemson, one's a neutral field. It's going to be really hard for Florida State to get over the hump. Now, could they be a better team and go 10-2 and you're improved and all? Yeah, certainly. But if they're going to take that jump that people think they're capable of, this is the kind of game they have to win. So that's going to be a big game, in my opinion. LSU against Florida State in Orlando on September the 3rd. That's going to be a really fun game to watch. The next weekend is going to be one of the best weekends of college football, in my opinion. Here are the games that are being played that weekend, September the 9th. Obviously, Notre Dame is going to be playing that weekend, so we'll get a chance to see the Irish play that weekend. I believe September the 9th is the weekend that they are playing NC State on the road. That's not one of my 10 top games, but that's going to be a really good game. You've got Texas A&M at Miami, Alabama at Texas, Wisconsin at Washington State, and Oregon at Texas Tech. Those are going to all be important games. So we're going to go down all 4 of those. I'm going to talk about a couple of the others quickly because the first 3 I'm going to talk about real quickly because I think they're more conference games than anything else. Texas A&M at Miami. I think this is more about the ACC's attempt to prove that they belong. Hey, we're not the ACC of the past. This isn't Clemson and everybody else. This is Clemson's really good. Florida State's really good. North Carolina's really good because look what they did to South Carolina. Miami's turning it around because they beat Texas A&M. They've got that win over the SEC. It's another opportunity for the ACC to get a win over the SEC, something they couldn't do a lot of last year. It's a statement opportunity for the ACC. That's what that game is. I think it's also for the SEC West a chance to say, hey, look, if your middle of the road teams are beating the other out-of-state conferences or out-of-conference teams, then all of a sudden it says a lot about what the SEC West is. It confirms what people already think about it. Then you look at another game, Wisconsin at Washington State. Now, I know that some of you might not think this is a game that is worthy of this conversation, but I'm going to look at it from 2 angles. The first angle I'm looking at it is sort of just briefly another Pac-12 opportunity to go out there and show that, hey, we're a really good league. Last year, and this really comes down to if Wisconsin is good as people think that they're going to be, and I have my doubts, I'm going to be honest, then this is a chance for Washington State to prove something. Because when Washington State beat Wisconsin last year, it was big at the time, but it kind of went away pretty quickly because we all quickly realized that Wisconsin's just not very good. 2 weeks later, they got destroyed by Ohio State. Then they got destroyed by Illinois. All of a sudden, they're a 2-3 team. They beat Northwestern, then they lose to a bad Michigan State team. All of a sudden, Wisconsin's 3-4, and nobody cares about that Washington State win. If Wisconsin's going to be better this year, and a lot of people think they are, I have my doubts. I think that transition to the air raid is going to be a lot tougher than people think. And I'm not a big Tanner Mordecai guy. But if they're right and I'm wrong, this is another chance for the Pac-12 to have a big win out of conference. And for Wisconsin, the other angle is this is a chance for Wisconsin to kind of do the same thing. Go on the road against a quality Washington State team. That was a very scrappy team last year, as we mentioned before. Beat Wisconsin last year, took USC down to the wire. Well, actually, I said down the wire. Took Oregon down to the wire. They battled USC tough for about 3 quarters. They lost a really close game to Utah. They were a quality team last year, in my opinion. And now you've got to go out and say, okay, we can kind of get this win. So then when you look at what it means for Wisconsin, they get that win. They get the Big Ten gets that win. You look at their first game, Buffalo. Their second game is Georgia Southern. Their next game is a Friday night game at Purdue. Now, that's not going to be an easy game, but Purdue's breaking in a lot of new players and a brand new football coach. Then you have a bye week. Then you have Rutgers at home. And then now all of a sudden you're going to October 14th matchup against what I think is going to be a really good Iowa team. That's some opportunity for great momentum for Wisconsin. Then they hit a 3-game stretch of Iowa at home, at Illinois, home against Ohio State. Now, I don't think they're going to beat Ohio State. But if you can beat Washington State and then hold serve at home, that's all you got to do after that. If you beat Washington State, it's essentially hold serve at home because the next, I would argue, 3 best teams are going to play are Iowa, Ohio State, and Nebraska. They got all those teams at home. You've got a chance to now go out and claim really early on that you can be one of the dominant teams in the Big Ten, and you can give some respect to the Big Ten West. So I don't know that they can do it, but I think that game could have some big ramifications for those 2 teams. And I'm also just looking forward to seeing what this Wisconsin team is going to look like in year 1 under not so much Luke Fickell, but Phil Longo. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. Another game that weekend, briefly talk about, is Oregon at Texas Tech. And I'm not going to talk about this from the Oregon standpoint because Oregon's supposed to win this game. This is not a huge game for Oregon. But this is a big game, in my opinion, more so for the Pac-12, the Big 12, and then more importantly for Texas Tech, because I'll be honest, folks, I really like what Joey McGuire's doing at Texas Tech. He's recruiting well. His teams are tougher. They try to play defense. As he recruits better players, they're going to get better on defense. This is a team that is, to me, was a very competitive team last year. They weren't great last year. They went 8-5, lost to NC State, but they beat Texas. They beat West Virginia, beat Kansas, beat Iowa State, beat Oklahoma, smacked Ole Miss in a bowl game. They had a competitive loss to Oklahoma State, competitive loss to Kansas State. So, and got blown out by Baylor. I like what they're doing. 8-5 team last year. But more importantly, this is a team where you're kind of jockeying with the Pac-12 for, if we're all going to assume that a Big Ten team is going to be in the playoff, let's say one of the 2 ACC teams is going to be in the playoff, and then an SEC team is going to be in the playoff. You're now jockeying for position with the Pac-12 and a second Big Ten or a second SEC for a playoff spot. So the better your conference can do out of conference, the better. If a team like Texas Tech can go and beat a team like Oregon, all of a sudden that gives a huge credence to your league, even if they just play Oregon tough. And let's say Oregon goes out and wins the Pac-12 and they go 12-1, and Texas goes 12-1, or Oklahoma or TCU or somebody in the Big 12 goes 12-1, you've got a couple chances there for the perception of your league to be better than that league. That's going to help you. And I think those games matter a lot more than people think. those non-conference games that kind of establish our conference versus your conference. And so that's a game I'm going to look for. But here's the big game on September 9th. This is the big one. This is going to be, in my opinion, one of the most I don't know if it's going to be one of the best games because you never know. But off-season wise, one of the most intriguing games. And that's September 9th, Alabama at Texas. This is also the second game that we've talked about that has direct national title implications for both teams. Alabama is a very interesting situation right now. They had a down year last year for them. There's a lot of people that would love to have an 11-2 down year like Alabama had last year, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that would say, hey, we had a down year in which we went 11-2, lost by a point at LSU, lost by 3 points at Tennessee when our kicker misses a field goal. And we smack Kansas State in the bowl game, smack Auburn, smack Austin Peay, smack Mississippi State, smack Arkansas, smack ULM, smack Utah State, gritty win over Texas. Like that's a down year that a lot of teams would have taken. Notre Dame fans would take that in a heartbeat after losing to Marshall and Stanford last year. So we're going to find out a lot about these two teams. Nick Saban made some really risky hires this offseason for different reasons. Tommy Rees is a risky hire simply because he's a young coach. He's still just 31 years old. His offenses in Notre Dame were not great. There's a lot of reasons you can explain that away. Nick Saban saw something in Tommy Rees that he really likes, and he's bringing him in. Tommy's going to have a really good staff around him. Coach Rees is going to have a really good staff around him. But the combination of a young 31-year-old fiery offensive coordinator with a unproven, a shaky, however you want to describe it, quarterback room coming off of a year in which you went 11-2, that could be interesting. Then you look at the defensive staff, whereas Coach Rees is sort of a risky hire, a young, talented, unproven coach that you see something in. Then there's the other side with Kevin Steele, who I think is one of the most overrated defensive coordinators in all of football. I think he's a great recruiter. And I joked last year that Mario Cristobal brought him and Charlie Strong in to recruit for a year before they went out and got a real defensive coordinator. Recruited really well at Clemson. Recruited well at Auburn. Recruited well at Miami. I've never thought much of him as a defensive coordinator. And so Nick Saban's now turning the reins over to him, and I'm very curious how that's going to go. Very, very curious how that's going to go. Because if Alabama's going to be a championship team this year, in my opinion, it's going to look a lot more like an old school Alabama team. I really believe that, meaning really good on defense, really good running game. Because for all the talk about the uncertainty at quarterback, and it's very fair and it's legitimate, we sometimes maybe don't talk enough about the fact that Alabama has an unproven but very talented running back room. I'm someone that has argued I don't really care about unproven running backs. If you're good at running back, you're good. Experience doesn't matter a whole lot to me. Last year, Audric Estime had 7 carries in his career, and they all came against all but one came against Navy the year before. Georgia Tech, maybe. I forget. Georgia Tech is who it came against. Very unproven player. But at running back, if you got the chops, you got the chops, right? Much more so than quarterback and offensive line and some other positions. Very young, but very talented running back room. We're returning one of the best tackles in football. I don't think their line is as talented as maybe some people make it out to be, but there are some really talented players. J.C. Latham, I think Tyler Booker's probably going to get a starting job this year. There's some talent there for them to work with, no question about it. But if Kevin Steele's not that guy, then I have some question marks about just how good Alabama's going to be this year. And when you look at Alabama's schedule, this game at Texas is going to tell us a lot about them because you're facing what should be a very good offensive football team. To me, a improving team from a talent standpoint in Texas. You're going on the road, and it's a huge test. It's only the second game of the year for them. So whoever your starting quarterback is going to be very unproven going into that game, and you've got a lot to prove. But it doesn't get any easier for Alabama coming out of that. 2 weeks later, they've got to go to they host Ole Miss. Week after that, they got to go to Mississippi State. Then they got to go to Texas A&M. Here's the reality about Texas A&M. Texas A&M hasn't been a very good team the last 2 years. They've given Alabama everything they can handle. They beat Alabama 2 years ago. and they were a late play away from beating Alabama last year, lost 24-20. Then they host Arkansas, who I think is going to be has a chance to be a quality team this year. Then they host Tennessee, bye week, host LSU, at Kentucky, 2 weeks later play at Georgia. And then if they can somehow win the SEC West against that schedule, they got to go probably play Georgia in the SEC title game. You can't afford to lose to Texas. If you lose to Texas, you're now in single elimination mode. You've got to beat Ole Miss, at Mississippi State, at A&M, Arkansas at home, Tennessee at home, LSU at home, at Kentucky, at Auburn, and you got to beat Georgia in the SEC title game if you want to be a playoff team. And so to me, this game is going to be huge for them in that regard. For Texas, this is an opportunity to show that, hey, we've arrived. We are back. Because there's always that thing, right? Like, oh, Texas is back, or Notre Dame is back, or whoever else is back. And you always have these conversations. And then you look at Texas and you say, well, I don't know if they're back or not. They sure are talented. They lost some guys on defense, but they bring a lot of players back. Offensively, their offensive line was very young last year. They're almost all back. I think they got 4 or 5 starters coming back on the offensive line. They got one of the best tight ends in college football in Jatavian Sanders. They've got Xavier Worthy coming back. They've got Jordan Whittington coming back. They've got some very talented young receivers. They got A.D. Mitchell from Georgia transferred in this offseason. So there's a lot of talent at Texas on the skill positions. And yes, they lost 2 running backs, actually, Roshan Johnson and Bijan Robinson last year. But they've got some very talented runners still there. And so defense should be better. I like Pete Kwiatkowski as a coordinator. I liked what he did at Washington. Can he get that defense going? This is your chance. You're going to face an Alabama offense that's learning somewhat of a new system, not entirely, but it's going to have a different look, questionable quarterback. You're facing a potentially great Alabama defense. I'm going to be either proven right about Kevin Steele or wrong about Kevin Steele in week 2. And this is that game. If he is a better coach than I think he is, then he's going to have a plan with that talent against Texas that's going to allow them to keep them in check. We're going to learn a lot about Quinn Ewers, but if Kevin Steele is who I think he is, Steve Sarkisian is going to coach circles around him. And then it's up to Quinn Ewers to get the ball where it needs to get to. So I'm very much looking forward to this game. And if they can't beat Alabama at home, then you say, okay, well, what's the loss look like? If it's a competitive loss and they can go out and go 10-2, 9-3, say, okay, Texas isn't back, but they're continuing to get better. Just give them more time, right? But if they can beat Alabama, not only does it kind of announce, hey, we're back, now you're in a great position to win 10-plus games next year if you're Texas, but you're also in a situation where if you can really thrive, they got Wyoming the next week, at Baylor, Kansas at home, Oklahoma in Dallas, at Houston, home against BYU, home against Kansas State, at TCU, at Iowa State, home against Texas Tech. That's if you're good enough to beat Bama and your players step up, you're good enough to beat everybody else on your schedule. Let's say they slip up once. You're now in a position where you're going into the Big 12 title game with a shot at making the playoff. That's the momentum you need as a program, and that's the momentum you need on the recruiting trail as you get ready to go into the SEC in 2024. Hugely important for Texas in that situation. So Bama gets established, maintain dominance. Texas gets a chance to put itself on the map. That's what's at stake for those 2 games. Let's fast forward 2 weeks later. Here's where we start talking about Notre Dame a little bit. Notre Dame's going to have 3 games on the schedule. It's the second big game for Notre Dame, but the first big national game. I think that NC State game is going to be pretty important as well for Notre Dame to kind of show, hey, we're a good football team. You know, look out for us. We've got turned the corner from Stanford and Marshall. We're a pretty good football team. But this is your first chance to prove that, hey, we're a legit playoff team. There's still some big games you got to win, but this is your first chance to prove it. This is your chance to go out and say, hey, listen, we are a team that is going to – I'm sorry, I talked about the Texas-Alabama game being at Texas. It's actually at Alabama. I misspoke. It's at Alabama. It was at Texas last year. So good call on that, Tom Balork. It's at Alabama this year, which even raises the stakes even more because it's a potential road game. So for me, when you look at Notre Dame, Ohio State, what's at stake for Notre Dame? Every Notre Dame fan knows this already, right? You have not proven that you can beat the big dogs when the big dogs are at their best. You beat Clemson, but you did it with DJ Uiagalelei twice. Not a great quarterback. He was a true freshman the first time, was struggling last year. It is what it is. They're not great teams. And then you look at what they did at Ohio State last couple times. I mean, they were competitive for 3 quarters, but at the end of the day, fourth quarter, it wasn't close. Ohio State completely outclassed in the fourth quarter of that game. You couldn't hang with them for 4 quarters. You had your moments where you made it a competitive game in 2015. You were out a lot of players. At the end of the day, that was a way better Ohio State team. You go back to 2005, you don't win that game. You lose back-to-back games in 95, 96. Ohio State is just, they own you at this point in time. And in order for you to be considered a team that's a great national program, I've said this before, if you want to be a great national program, you have to first show that you're the best team in the Midwest. And right now, Michigan's the only team challenging Ohio State for that moniker. Notre Dame is not, because Notre Dame has not been competitive against the Buckeyes in these type of moments. This is your chance to earn that big win. This is your chance to have that statement win. This is one of the biggest potential statement games of the season for anybody, not just Notre Dame. This is a huge game for them. You win this game, all of a sudden, you're a team that's got a chance to go out there and say, hey, we've arrived. It's like Stanford 2012 for Notre Dame. Stanford was a big dog at the time, consensus top, consistent top 10 team for those couple years with Andrew Luck. And then the 2012 team finished in the top 10 as well. They had smashed Notre Dame. They beat them in 2009. They beat them in 10. They beat them in 11. You hadn't beaten them since 2008. And you were able to get that big statement win. But even then, Stanford was not like Ohio State is now. It was a really good football team, but it wasn't the program, the established program from a perception standpoint that Ohio State is. So you get a double dose of positivity here for Notre Dame. You get the mental team building thing like what Oklahoma was in 2012, or excuse me, what Stanford was in 2012. But you also get the big picture. We've arrived on the national stage type of win like they had in 1988 when they beat Miami, and 93 when they beat Florida State. That's how big this game is for Notre Dame, in my opinion. It wouldn't have, like, if you'd have beat Georgia in 2017, it wouldn't have been that kind of statement win, because Georgia wasn't then what they are now. We didn't know that Georgia's about to go on a really impressive run. So even though it was a big game, it didn't have the same amount on the line that this game has. Notre Dame was coming off of a 4-8 year. Georgia was 8-5. It was year 2 of Kirby. We didn't know their starting quarterback had just gotten hurt against App State and Jacob Eason. Got this freshman kid starting named Jake Fromm. We didn't know what they were going to be. This is a statement win. For Ohio State, this is a chance for a game that gives you sort of a little bit of breathing room. Obviously, if you lose this game, you're now in single elimination mode. This is a huge game for Ohio State. Ohio State goes into their fourth game of the year. They open it at Indiana. Then they have Youngstown and Western Kentucky home. Game 4, you go into a situation where if you lose this game, you are in single elimination, the single elimination world for the next 2 months. You play Michigan on November 25th. You play Notre Dame on September 23rd. You lose to Notre Dame, you're in single elimination mode for 2 months. And that includes a home game against Penn State, at Wisconsin, at Michigan, and then the Big Ten title game if they can run the table. So it puts a lot of pressure on Ohio State to go out there and run the table and get that done if they lose to Notre Dame. If they beat Notre Dame, now all of a sudden Ohio State has a sort of a game. You're playing a little bit with house money to a degree. Let's just say hypothetically that October 21st, Penn State, who has been giving Ohio State fits for years. Now, they haven't been able to beat Ohio State. It's like, 14, I think? No, 16. But 9 of the last 10, Ohio State's won. Penn State finally knocks you off. Or a week later, you lose at Wisconsin. If you have 2 kind of bookend games, one in September, one in November, that gives you a lot of breathing room in between. and that is at Notre Dame and at Michigan. Or if you beat Notre Dame and then beat Penn State and beat Wisconsin, you're in a very similar situation to they were this past season against Michigan, where if Michigan beats you and you're still 11-0, you've got a big win over Penn State, big win over Notre Dame, big win over Wisconsin, you can survive that loss and still have a chance to go out and either play in the Big Ten title game, because it's not a given that Michigan, even though their schedule's soft, it's not a given that Michigan will be a one-loss team or a no-loss team when they play that game. But you're also in a situation where even if you lose and you don't play in the Big Ten title game, you've got a shot, an outside shot to still get in the playoff if some other teams lose. And that's exactly what happened to Ohio State this year. Tennessee goes out and gets beat down the stretch. Clemson goes out and gets beat down the stretch. USC goes out and gets beat down the stretch. And all of a sudden, Ohio State backs into the playoff. And then when they backed in, as Ohio State showed last year, it doesn't matter how they get in. What matters is they get in. If they get in, they can play with anybody for the most part. The 2020 team, I don't count that 2020 game against Bama the way that some people do. They were on game 8. Like the conference did them no favors. Bama was a well-oiled machine. Ohio State, they beat a mediocre Clemson team that just didn't impress me really that year in 2020. Even with Trevor, they weren't as good as they were 19 or 18 or 16. But this team, to me, you have the win over Clemson that year, which is good. You had the great game against the 2019 Clemson team, which Ohio State went toe-to-toe with them. That was a really good Clemson team. If not for how great LSU was, probably if it wasn't for that elite LSU team, Clemson probably wins a third title in 4 years. That's how good that Clemson team was in 19. In my opinion, it's just there was a phenomenal LSU team. So if you back in, you've still got a chance to win a championship like we saw last year against Georgia. So huge for both of those teams, in my opinion. Huge for both of those teams. Let's go forward here. That's September 23rd. Let's move forward a couple more weeks and look at October 14th. This is kind of a Notre Dame stretch here, folks, we're going to talk about. USC at Notre Dame. And the reason we're talking about Notre Dame here is because most of these teams are playing all conference games at that point in time, except teams playing Notre Dame. October 14th, USC at Notre Dame. For Notre Dame, it's exactly what we said before. It's a chance for you to show that you're a playoff team. You got to hold serve at home, right? That's the thing for Notre Dame. You got to hold serve at home. It's a chance for them to kind of reestablish, okay, yes, last year was a big win for USC. They beat Notre Dame, beat us by 11. We didn't have Cam Hart. We didn't have Tariq Bracy. We were playing our backup quarterback. All the excuses that Notre Dame fans want to use, and some of them justify, but the fact is USC was better than you last year. But now it's a chance to say, okay, that was last year. This is this year. We've now leveled the playing field a little bit at quarterback. We're a more veteran team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is your chance to prove that and build your playoff resume. We're going to talk a whole lot more about Notre Dame because it's a lot of the stuff that you proved against Ohio State if you're able to win that game. For USC, this is a chance for them to go on the road and earn a big ranked win. As long as Notre Dame doesn't get upset by NC State, Duke, or Louisville, which is possible, but as long as their only loss is to Ohio State, this is still a chance to get a big win over a ranked team. And they're going to need that because running the table in the Pac-12 this year is going to be a lot harder for USC than it was last year. Last year, USC was able to avoid Oregon and they were able to avoid Washington. This year, it's a different story. They have to play Utah as they always do, but they also have to play at Oregon and they play Ohio and they play Washington at home. So the start to their season is not super tough. They play San Jose State, Nevada, Stanford, bye week, at Arizona State. We'll see how that is. At Colorado, I don't think they're going to be very, very good. Home against Arizona. Their first big test is at Notre Dame. But that begins a stretch of 5 out of 6 games that is going to be rough. They play at Notre Dame. Then they play Utah at home, at Cal, which is the easy one, supposedly easy one. We'll see. I don't think Cal's going to be that good this year. It should be. I'm just saying it should be an easy one. Then you have Washington at home, and I can't wait to watch that offense against the USC defense and vice versa. That's going to be a high-scoring game most likely. Then they play at Oregon and home against UCLA. So if USC is going to be able to survive a stubbing of their toe in the regular season like they did against Utah last year, they can't lose Notre Dame. If they lose to Notre Dame, then they're like Ohio State, they're in single elimination mode. And being in single elimination mode with games against Utah, Washington, Oregon, UCLA, and then a potential rematch against one of those 4 teams, that's going to be tough for USC. So for them, this is a big opportunity for them to say, hey, we've got a really brutal stretch, 6-game stretch down the end of the season with no bye. USC's bye is after UCLA. So they have a bye on September 16th. Because remember, this is one of those 2 bye years for teams that play in late August in week 0, and USC also plays in week 0, like Notre Dame does. But their second bye is at the end of the regular season. So they have a bye between UCLA and the Pac-12 title game. So you have a stretch of 6 straight games against Notre Dame, Utah, Cal, Washington, Oregon, and UCLA. If you lose the first one of those, you got to think their national title chances are on life support. And that's what's at stake for them. Counter argument, if they win that game, they have a much improved resume for the playoff where they can now afford to maybe stub their toe and maybe still get in, because whoever beats them in the regular season, they get a rematch against in the Pac-12 title game, and then it'll be tough to beat USC twice. I don't think USC is going to have a great defense this year, but I think it's going to be definitely better than it was last year. And that's all. They just need a defense that's okay with what I expect they're going to be on offense, and we'll see if they can get that done. So that'll be a very, very, very interesting situation. Last game I'm going to talk about here, actually last 2, Notre Dame at Clemson. Don't need to repeat a lot of things about Notre Dame, except that this is your chance that if you did stub your toe against UCLA, USC, or Ohio State, as long as you're 1-1, this is the kind of win that gives you a chance to kind of vault back up playing at Clemson. For Clemson, this is a chance to where one of 2 things is going to be true for Clemson this year in this game. Number 1, Clemson's undefeated. So they beat Duke in the opener at Duke. They beat Florida State at home. They beat Miami on the road. They beat NC State on the road. They've got North Carolina coming up at home, Georgia Tech coming up at home, and at South Carolina. So if you are undefeated, this is your chance to really lay claim to a playoff berth. If you dropped a game, let's say they drop at Miami or NC State, maybe they lose in September to Florida State. Let's say they do that. They lose to September to Florida State. You know you have a good chance of getting a rematch against Florida State. You can't lose to Notre Dame. If you lose to Notre Dame, you're done. If you beat Notre Dame, you can now get within striking distance of a playoff berth if you can keep winning and then go beat Florida State in the ACC title game. So that's a huge game for Clemson. And it's for Notre Dame also, the unique aspect of this is that I will add, Notre Dame and Clemson have played each other. They played each other in 15, 18, twice in 20, and then once last year. Clemson is currently 3-2 against Notre Dame. So Clemson won in 15 and 18 and then 20. However, Notre Dame has won 2 of the last 3. They beat them in the regular season in 2020, lost in the ACC title game, but then beat Clemson again last year. The fact that a win at Clemson this year not only makes Notre Dame 3-1 against Clemson in the last 4 seasons, but when you look at the nature of last year's beating of Clemson, and it was literally a beating, now all of a sudden Notre Dame can say, hey, this is a team we had to pass. We've passed them. You go on the road and beat Clemson this year, you've now established dominance against that particular rivalry. You've taken a team that's won 2 titles in recent history, and you've now basically said, we're a better program than you. We've beat you 3 out of 4 times. You have not won a title in that stretch. So you're not saying, hey, well, we've won a title. That's now outside that 5-year window that we look at to say, like, you know, where you are right now. Notre Dame can say, hey, we've beat you 3 out of 4 times. And the only time you've beat us, looking at it from Notre Dame standpoint, is when you've had a generational quarterback. So, yeah, of course you beat us with Deshaun Watson. Of course you beat us with Trevor Lawrence. But you've never beat us with anybody out that. Now, that's a lame argument for now because you're 2-3 against them. But you go out there and beat them again after the way you pounded them last year. Now, all of a sudden, that argument holds a lot of water. If you lose to them, it's like you're 2-2 in the last 4 games. You're 2-4 overall. And Clemson says, we're still better than you. You could beat us here, you beat us there, but we're still a better program than you. So there's a lot at stake in that regard, too, on top of the national championship stuff. And then here's the last game we're going to talk about. Florida State at Florida. This is going to be an interesting game because I don't think Florida is going to be that good this year. When I look at the Gators, I see a team, I think they're going to lose to Utah. They got to play Tennessee, at Kentucky, at South Carolina. They got to play Georgia, Arkansas, at LSU. Their crossover games this year are not going to be easy. They've got to not only play Utah on the road, but they've got to play Arkansas and LSU in crossover games, and they have to play Florida State. They have a very tough schedule this season. I'll give Florida credit. They have a very tough schedule this year. They manned up. Not only did they play Florida State, they're playing Utah in a home and home. So they got to go on the road this year. Very challenging schedule. And the league did them no favors by giving them a crossover game at LSU. So I think Florida's going to be down a little bit. So why am I talking about this game? Well, as long as Florida State at least goes 1-1 against LSU and Clemson, they're in a position where they're getting upset by Wake or Pitt on the road or Miami at home away from being a playoff team. They're just going to have to go to the ACC title game and win, and they're going to have a great shot to be in a playoff, unless you're overlooking the Gators. I could see Florida being a situation when I look at their schedule. Let's look at Florida's schedule. Let's just kind of run through a worst case scenario for them. You lose to Utah, you beat McNeese State, you lose at home to Tennessee, you beat Charlotte, you lose at Kentucky, you beat Vanderbilt, you lose at South Carolina, you lose at Georgia, so you have a nice upset win over Arkansas, you lose at LSU, you have a nice bounce back and beat Missouri on the road. You're 5-6. You flip one of those games. Okay, they beat Kentucky or they beat Tennessee at home or South Carolina, one of those games. Now you're 6-5. You're going to have some really big wins to be 7-4, 8-3. I just don't see Florida being that team. Not with Graham Mertz at quarterback and some of the other issues they have. So when I look at that team, I just don't have a lot of faith that Florida has a good enough roster right now to run that gauntlet and be anything better than 7-4. I think that's the best case scenario. Maybe Florida State overlooks them a little bit. This could be a game where the ACC has a chance to just say, hey, we're a legit conference. Clemson beat South Carolina. North Carolina beat South Carolina. Utah beat Florida. You've had a lot of good out-of-conference wins, and then you go stub your toe against Florida, and you're in trouble. That's the reality of it. So that's why this game concerns me. It's not that it's two teams. It's a rivalry game. It's not two teams that I think are playoff contenders. It's that game. If you're Florida State, you say you can't overlook it. Now, again, it's a rivalry game, so you'd think that they wouldn't overlook it. But I've seen worse. I've seen Alabama overlook Auburn before and get stub their toe, right? We've seen that. You just got to have to make sure. So those are the 10 games for me, folks. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, whether you're leaving them live or if you're listening later to check it out. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What non-conference games am I missing that are games that can have an impact on who's playing for a championship, or just games that you're looking forward to seeing? I know one game that I'm looking forward to seeing, I think it's in week 1, is North Carolina, South Carolina. I'm really curious to see what that North Carolina offense is going to look like without Phil Longo. How's Drake May going to be in year 2? That's going to be a really good game. There's Notre Dame, NC State is going to be a big game. There's some really Penn State at West Virginia, or West Virginia at Penn State's a game that I'm curious to see. So there's some really good games. Colorado TCU is one that people mentioned. I just don't care about that game. I think it'll be intriguing, but it's not going to impact college football championship because I just don't think that Colorado is going to be very good this year. So we'll see how it goes. But, I'll be watching what Coach Sanders does this year at Colorado for sure. But so I'm very curious to see what they're going to look like, Andrew. I agree with you on that. I want to see what they're going to do, but it's not going to be an impact game. But it can also, if you want to leave a comment, maybe it's a game that's not an impact game, but it's just one you're really looking forward to seeing. Let me know in the comments section. Definitely let me know what you think of it. And also, folks, do me a favor, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. If you're listening via podcast platform, please give us a 5-star review. We'd greatly appreciate that. Want to thank everybody. Before I do completely leave, I do have 3 super chats I want to get to. So I want to thank you all for that. We have one from Andrew Gilmore. He says, thank you for the super chat, Andrew. He says, during the BK era, USC did not have their act together. They do now. 11 wins in year 1 of Riley. Strong NIL and portal. Possibly top 5 2024 class. We'll see. Will South Carolina, or excuse me, USC be Coach Marcus Freeman's biggest hurdle to the playoff long term? Yes and no. No, from the standpoint, Andrew, that I think Notre Dame's biggest hurdle to the playoff long term is Notre Dame, right? Like, are you doing what you need to do to go out and be successful? I don't care what Lincoln Riley does. I'm a believer that Notre Dame needs to be Notre Dame. If you do you're going to win a lot of those games. Maybe you lose some on the road, and that's like Coach Parsegian had a tough time against them. Coach Holtz dominated USC, even some years where they had some really good teams. Do what you need to do at home. 1988, Notre Dame, what stands between Notre Dame and the national title? Number 2 USC at USC. Rodney Peete at quarterback. I think Junior Seau was on that team, I believe. But that was a team that was very, very good football team. And, Notre Dame goes out and they handle their business. Yeah, Junior Seau was on that team in 1988. Very talented USC team, but Notre Dame was just better. They were tougher. They were more physical. And I'm seeing some of that now is, can USC, be able to handle a Notre Dame team that's physical? Does the speed outweigh it? The other thing I would say to you is he's got to prove to me at USC that he can continue to get the quarterbacks that he got at Oklahoma. I would think he can, but you still have to prove it, right? It's still a situation where you have to prove it. Who is their quarterback? Is going to be Malachi Nelson? Is it going to be a portal guy? What are they going to do? But I still think Notre Dame needs to be Notre Dame. That's step one. Where I say yes is because if he builds USC to be like they were at Oklahoma, that's a tough out, right? Now you should, beat them at home, and the ones on the road are going to be tough. So in that regard, I would say yes, Andrew. But is it a situation where do I think they're going to go out there and lose like 7 out of 10 like they've done to USC? No, I don't think it's going to be that. I think it at worst, it's kind of a 50-50. Maybe they upset you at home once, and then you get them back at their place in a year where you're really good. I could see something like that. But I think it's going to be really tough battles, certainly. I don't think they're going to dominate USC the way that they did under Coach Holtz or in recent years under Kelly. As you mentioned, USC wasn't very good when Brian Kelly went against him. And the couple good USC teams they had smacked Notre Dame outside of 2017, which obviously was a big Notre Dame win. But most of the other good at USC teams, the Lane Kiffin had that really good team in 11 that beat Notre Dame. They had the pretty good team in 14. Late in the year, they were good, smacked Notre Dame. The 2016 team was really good. They smacked Notre Dame. So for the most part, outside of 2017, Notre Dame didn't beat any good USC teams, to your point. We'll see if Coach Freeman can have better success, but we're going to find out. But I think that if you do you at Notre Dame, you're going to win more of those. You're going to win those games at home. And then it's like, hey, can you win some on the road? Just like Coach Holtz did. Like I said, they're going to be better, I think, than what they were under Coach Holtz, but they won those games. And I don't think USC is going to be as good as they were when Coach Parsegian was at Notre Dame either. So that's the other part of it. Charlie Weiss's last belt loop has super chat. Thank you, Charlie. Does Coach Marcus Freeman hear or know how disappointed many of us are in Golden, Washington, and O'Leary? Do you think he is upset behind closed doors? Thanks, BD. Appreciate the super chat. I don't think Coach Freeman gives a rip what I think, what you think, what anybody else thinks. And honestly, to a degree, he shouldn't. I mean, look, if you're the head coach of Notre Dame, you should have some level of awareness of where the fan base is, but you don't make decisions off of it. I would think very lowly of Marcus Freeman if he was like, man, the Irish Breakdown Board is pissed at Coach Washington. I should probably make a move. I would have serious questions about Marcus Freeman if that was happening. I don't want him to care about what they say. Now, what I hope he cares about is not what I say or you say or anybody else says. What I hope he cares about is we're not getting the job done at this position, that position, whatever the position, and it needs to be addressed. And now he may not agree that the problem is as bad as we think it is. There's a chance of that too. He may know more about some of these recruitments. Say, look, you guys can be upset about it if you want, but we weren't going to get that guy. And here's why. My coach didn't do anything wrong. We'll find out if he believes that. But I think in some instances, I do believe that Coach Freeman's aware of certain issues that exist. Whether or not what he'll do to fix them, I don't know. But I do think there's a level of awareness with some of those issues. Like, I'll be willing to bet he doesn't view the defensive line recruiting the way that some of you do. And I have my issues with Coach Washington as well. But the difference is I'm willing to also say, man, I love Cole Mullins. Man, I love Logan Thomas. I'm really high on Bryce Young. Because my thing with Coach Washington is I think the issue isn't D-line recruiting, it's D-tackle recruiting. Because I think defensive end recruiting the last 2 years has been pretty good. Some of it he deserves credit for, some of it not so much. That's part of it when you have a staff turnover. Brendan Vernon was already committed before he was hired. I don't punish him for that. I mean, it is what it is. But I think defensive end recruiting has been pretty good. I mean, last 2 years they've landed Cole Mullins, Logan Thomas, Bryce Young, Boubacar Traore, Armel Mukam, and Brendan Vernon. That's pretty good. And then, of course, you've had Josh Burnham move over there and Junior Chalamaka from the year before. You got Tyson Ford. So I think D-line recruiting is probably perceived as better than we all think it is, or at least some of the people in the chat that think it's terrible. I don't think it's terrible. I think they've had some misses that they can't afford to have if you're going to compete for a title. I'm a lot higher on Cole Mullins and Logan Thomas, I think, than a lot of people are. And I think that factors into it, Charlie, because I don't care what Cole Mullins' rankings are. I'm telling you what the film says. And the film says that's a top 100 football player. Well, in my view, if I'm going to be fair to Al Washington, then I think he's landed a top 100 football player. I think he landed a top 150 player with big-time upside in Logan Thomas. I can't be mad about that. D-tackle recruiting, bigger issue. And getting the really big-time guys, the big-name guys, that's an issue. And I would hope that Coach Freeman would address it, but I highly doubt he feels about defensive line recruiting the way that he probably should about linebacker recruiting or even safety recruiting to a degree. I would hope and think that he thinks those are big. This is just my opinion, bigger issues than defensive line recruiting at this point in time. Doesn't mean that he thinks that defensive line recruiting can't get better, but it just means that I don't think he's probably as upset about it as some of us are. And then the last super chat, and again, we're only doing super chats tonight, so I appreciate these. Nathan Milton says, does Tyler Buckner start and finish the year as quarterback one at Alabama? I have no idea, Nathan. I really don't. Do I think Tyler's going to be the starter? Probably, unless Ty Simpson has a really good offseason. I would imagine Tyler's going to win the job. Tyler's a talented quarterback. It's just, can he stay healthy? That's a bigger question. I don't think the environment's going to bother Tyler. I think Tyler's a pretty calm kid. I mean, look, guys, he was starting quarterback at Notre Dame, right? That he understands pressure. It's a different kind of pressure, but he understands pressure. The question is can he improve some of the areas where he needs to enhance his mechanics and decision-making and consistency? We saw in the South Carolina game, Tyler can be a big-time playmaker, but Nick Saban's not going to be okay with you throwing 3 picks and 2 pick sixes. That's just not going to happen. So can he eliminate that? We'll see. Kid hadn't played football in 2 months when he had that game too, right? Can he stay healthy for a whole year? Much bigger question. And I think that's more about what Tyler has to prove. We'll find out if he can. So thanks for the super chats, folks. I really appreciate that. Thanks, everybody, for being with us tonight. I want to thank you all for joining me. Have a great rest of your night. We'll be back tomorrow. I believe it's going to be me and Ryan Roberts tomorrow. I got to get with my other guys. I got Sean Stiers is out. Vince is on vacation. So I got to figure out who I'm going to be with tomorrow. But we're going to have a Notre Dame 2023 team preview coming up tomorrow. I think we're going to be on the offensive side of the ball. We've still got to cover tight ends, running. I think we got to do O-line and running backs. I think we're going to maybe do O-line tomorrow. So I'm not 100% sure on that. I got to look at my schedule. But we're going to have a team preview for an offensive side of the ball tomorrow. That'll be a lot of fun. Then, of course, we'll be back on Friday for the mailbag. So thanks for being with us, folks. Hit that like, hit that subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, check out the merch store, sign up for Irish Breakdown message boards, the Champions Lounge at boards.irishbreakdown.com. And of course, sign up for our newsletter to get all of our top stories. We appreciate all of your support. Stay with us through the month of July. I know it's a busy time and getting away, but keep checking out our stories, keep being in our shows. We greatly appreciate everything that y'all do. Love to hear some of your feedback about what the big games are that you're looking forward out of conference. Going to be a lot of fun. So thanks for joining me, folks, and I'll talk to you again very soon on the Irish Breakdown podcast.